The story begins inside and in where Gail Hamilton was busy making notes on ways to improve the performance of his party. Without any warning, the party leader called his name and apologized, telling him that they were terminating his contract then and there. Gail was taken completely by surprise. The leader continued and made it clear that as of that day, Gail was being removed from the Wolfpack. Shortly after, the entire group was gathered around table. Gail sat there scratching his head, struggling to process what he had just been told. The leader told him to pay attention and listen carefully. Cush Bilbor, the party's paladin, stated it plainly, telling Gail that he had been fired. Gail could not even finish forming a response before the word hit him. Fired. He could not understand why. One of the women at the table laughed and grabbed at his face mockingly. Luke, the party's thief, told her to leave Gail alone. The girl was named Melissa, and she served as a light fighter. She made a dismissive and mocking remark about him. Norris, the black mage, snickered and said something suggesting he was not surprised by how things had turned out. Gail stood up and told them to hold on, asking them to give him a moment because the decision felt like it had come out of nowhere. Cush looked at him with an expression somewhere between disbelief and contempt, asking whether Gail genuinely had no idea why they were letting him go. Gail thought back over the 3 years they had been together as a party. From the very beginning, when they were still low-ranked adventurers, he had been crafting cursed items to help support the group and give them an edge. He told them honestly that he could not say he understood the reason. Cush mocked him for being so slow to understand. He laid it out bluntly. Gail's job class was Curse Crafter, which Cush declared to be the worst support role in existence. All Gail could do was debuff monsters using one-time use cursed items he had made, and beyond that the party had no use for him. On top of that, Gail had the lowest level in the group, still stuck at 31. Gail pushed back, acknowledging that Curse Crafter was not a common or mainstream job class, but pointing out that his items had helped the party complete a large number of quests without any serious difficulty. He could keep the curses calibrated at a manageable level, and with the right priest or talisman, the curses could even be dispelled afterward. Not everything he made was a consumable item either. He pulled out a necklace he had crafted, a passive type that continuously affected monsters in their vicinity. The others reacted with disgust and told him to put it away immediately. Cush demanded to know what could possibly possess him to wear something like that, and questioned what was wrong with him. Cush then laid out the real reason for the decision. They had reached S rank, and at that level they had no need for Gail's cursed traps and items. They had also brought in someone new, a woman named Moria Glaris, a support mage who had mastered both buff and debuff skills, arrived at the table at that moment and greeted everyone. Gail noticed that she was quite pretty. The rest of the party welcomed her warmly. Cush turned back to Gail and asked whether things were clear to him now. They no longer had any use for him. As Gail turned away from them, he could still hear them murmuring behind him, commenting that low-level members were a burden on S-rank parties and that it had only been a matter of time before this happened. Gail turned back and made one more attempt, asking them to give him another chance. He had been holding back on introducing new materials because he had not wanted to disrupt the way things were running, but he had developed a range of powerful cursed items that he believed they would find genuinely useful. The table went quiet. Everyone simply looked at him in silence. Cush stared without expression. Gail felt his eyes begin to sting with tears. He asked them whether they were truly certain they would not regret the decision. Cush said he was absolutely certain. Gail thought about everything the past 3 years had meant to him. He had supported every member of that party throughout their time together. He had not been able to deliver the kind of flashy, dramatic moments that others could, but completing quests alongside them had meant a great deal to him. He had hoped to remain part of the Wolfpack indefinitely. Cush advised him to simply give up on adventuring altogether and consider opening a shop selling cursed items instead. Melissa laughed and said he would probably attract a very particular kind of customer. Norris said he would be sure to tell people about it, framing it in the most unflattering way possible. Luke was the only one who said anything that was not unkind, mentioning that he had never personally had anything against Gail. Gail responded quietly, said it had been good working with them, and walked away. As he moved down the hallway, he turned the situation over in his mind with growing bitterness, asking himself what was wrong with those people after everything they had shared over the years. He remembered that Cush had told him he would cover his room and board, but that since he had spent so much of his own money on expensive curse ingredients, Cush was keeping his share of the earnings for himself. Gail worked through the implication of that in his head. He had essentially been working for free. He cursed himself, thinking about how deeply unfair the whole thing was. He glanced back and could see the group laughing together. At the doorway, he made a decision. He reached into his things and pulled out a piece of paper-like material. He had never told them about it, because he had known they would complain, but over time he had quietly slipped certain items into their equipment that passively boosted their base abilities across the board. Perhaps that had not been wanted or appreciated after all. He began to chant a dispel. A circular gleam of magic lit up around him as it activated. The effort hit him physically, and his face throbbed with pain from the exertion. He slumped to the floor and sat there breathing hard. The reason it cost him so much was tied to how cursed gear worked. A great deal of cursed equipment placed a binding curse back upon the person who created it, taking back from the crafter in equal measure whatever the gear gave to the user in terms of power. The curses Gail had woven into the equipment that Kush and the rest of the party had been wearing had boosted their overall capabilities, but as a consequence had subtly reduced the experience points they earned and placed a minor status ailment on them throughout. And all of that had been done quietly, without any of them ever knowing. The full weight of what Gail had been doing quietly for years became clear. He had been absorbing the negative stat effects that came with the cursed gear onto himself, taking on all the drawbacks so that the rest of the party could enjoy only the benefits and become stronger as a result. He sighed and clenched his hands, noting that it had given him quite a bit of recoil, but also that he already felt considerably lighter without the burden. Kush and the others would now lose the boosting effects the curses had been providing them, but that was no longer his concern. They had a new support member now, and that was their business. As for Gail himself, since the rest of the party had all been around level 50, and he had been absorbing roughly 20% of their stat reductions each, the accumulated experience had quietly pushed him forward. When he checked his own stats, he found that he had leveled up all the way to 48. His job class was Curse Crafter. His stamina stood at 1,311, his strength at 980, his defense at 1,024, his magic at 3,402, his agility at 835, and his resistance at 4,509. He also had 875 unspent status points remaining, along with 8 item slots for his cursed items. For context, Kush as a paladin had 5,000 in strength and 3,000 in defense, which meant Gail was actually sitting at a remarkably high level for someone working a support job. A woman from the inn approached him and asked how long he planned to sit there on the floor, and if he had already checked out, she suggested he see himself to the exit. Gail apologized and got up. He walked outside and stretched out his arms, letting the air settle around him as he asked himself what he was going to do now. He had no money, but he had all of his cursed gear with him. When he looked ahead, he noticed someone drawing in a crowd at a roadside stall, calling out to passersby to come and take a look. The sight of it stirred something in him. He remembered that one of his former party members had sarcastically suggested he give up adventuring and open a cursed shop somewhere. He was not particularly pleased about doing exactly what they had suggested, but the honest truth was that running his own shop had always been something of a quiet dream of his. Somewhere out in the countryside, a simple tool shop perhaps, where he could sleep when he wanted, eat when he wanted, craft whatever cursed items interested him, and pursue whatever research caught his attention. He was now free to do all of that. The thought of it filled him with something unexpected. He was actually starting to feel excited. He decided to set up a stall right away and earn enough money to cover his travel expenses. It was time to begin. Back at the Silver Wolf Inn, the remaining members of the Wolfpack sat down to a meal that had just been served. Kush remarked that he was feeling much better, and Norris agreed wholeheartedly that it was a relief to be free of Gail's presence. They said that regardless of how long Gail had been with them, they had indulged him far too long and should have made the change sooner. Moria, who had just joined the group, sat quietly listening to all of this. The others seemed to remember she was there and offered a brief acknowledgement of the awkwardness. Kush explained that he and Gail had known each other from the very beginning of the party's formation, which had made it genuinely difficult to make the call to let him go. He also mentioned something that had been on his mind, that Gail had occasionally fiddled with their equipment, adding what he had dismissed as good luck charms or something similar. Then something happened without warning. Strange lights appeared above them, and their gear began to glow all at once. Everyone at the table reacted with shock. Moria looked up and recognized immediately what she was seeing. It appeared to be a dispel of some kind. The others had no idea what it meant or what was happening. Norris mentioned that his magic felt noticeably thinner. Luke said he felt heavier than usual. Moria was just as surprised as the rest of them. She noted that whatever had just happened, the spell involved had been quite powerful. Kush jumped to the conclusion that it was some kind of retaliation from Gail. Melissa agreed that it was probably his doing. Norris suggested it might be revenge for being dropped from the party. Luke expressed open hostility, saying they should have dealt with him more definitively while they had the chance. But Moria was turning the whole thing over in her mind with a different kind of concern. If Gail had placed a harmful curse on them, she would have understood it as an act of anger. But a dispel working against them made no sense by conventional logic. And if it had affected all 4 of them simultaneously, the only explanation was that the caster had been undoing something he himself had previously put in place. She did not believe there had been any malicious intent behind it. Kush dismissed all of this and declared that whatever the explanation, Gail was their enemy now, and Moria needed to understand quickly how the Wolfpack operated and fall in line. She was about to explain that what they had witnessed was not an attack, but a dispel, but Kush shut her down before she could finish speaking. Norris threatened to incinerate Gail with his magic the next time they crossed paths. Luke pointed out with dry amusement that Norris had just said his magic had thinned out and wondered whether he could actually follow through on that. Norris insisted he had been imagining things. The two of them descended into bickering. Melissa commented with some distaste that they had really sunk low. Kush told her to let them go on. Moria sat quietly and thought carefully. She did not believe she was imagining things. She had felt it herself at the exact moment the spell activated. All of their stats had dropped simultaneously, almost as though something that had been constantly working in their favor had suddenly been removed. It felt exactly like a sustained buff of some kind had been stripped away all at once. She turned the idea over and pushed back against it, wondering if she was reading too much into it. But curse crafters were not supposed to be capable of applying buffs to other people. If Gail had created a cursed item that could do something like that, he would be the first of his kind. No ordinary curse crafter could produce something that worked that way. But what if Gail was not ordinary? Melissa came over and asked what was troubling her, offering her a drink. Moria thanked her and accepted it, but her mind was still working through the problem. If a curse crafter genuinely capable of what she was beginning to suspect had just walked out of this party, she could not help but ask herself whether the Wolfpack could still honestly call themselves an S-rank team. The thought nagged at her. Could it really have been Gail all along? Kush called the group back to attention and redirected everyone toward what was coming the following day. He said Gail was no longer relevant to any of them, not with what they had lined up. It was going to be their first S-rank quest. The table buzzed with excitement. Everyone was eager and ready, talking about proving to the guild just how powerful the Wolfpack truly was. Their first assignment was to take down a behemoth, a disaster-class monster. They were confident it would be straightforward and that glory was right around the corner. Moria sat among them and said nothing. She did not yet know at that moment the full extent of what their former curse crafter had actually been doing for them, or what it truly meant for the Wolfpack now that he was gone. She took a long drink from her cup. Meanwhile, somewhere outside, Gail could be heard shouting at a bird that had apparently snatched his necklace and was refusing to give it back. In the second chapter, Gail was at the Pumpkin Seed Merchants Guild confirming his intention to open a market stall. He told the man behind the counter that he was looking for a spot in the central square of the capital. The man said that area was a popular location and would cost 4 gold coins per day. Gail reached into his pocket while the man waited, but when he looked down at what he was holding, he saw his entire life savings amounted to 3 silver coins. The man quickly mentioned that the stalls on the road leading up to the square were considerably cheaper. Gail agreed to take one of those instead. He gathered all of his belongings and brought them to the front of his assigned stall. It was not in particularly good condition, but he decided it was enough to work with. The man from the guild handed him a starter kit, a tall and well-worn set of display equipment. Gail thanked him and shook his hand. He began thinking about what he would sell, planning to put out his spare cursed items alongside some goods that might appeal to people looking for interesting decorative pieces. He was not entirely sure what to charge for any of it, but figured that as long as he covered his material costs, he would at least be breaking even. As he began setting things out, clattering items around on the display, he had a nagging feeling that the way he was arranging everything was not quite right. Then the merchant guild man came back and told him he had forgotten to pass something along. He slapped a printed sheet against Gail's face and pointed out that his display arrangement was all wrong. He then took over and rearranged things himself, and when he was done, Gail looked at the result with genuine amazement. Everything was suddenly organized and visually appealing in a way it had not been before. Gail thanked the man again with real gratitude. The man gave him a piece of advice before returning to his post, saying that everyone had their own approach, but that if customers could not easily find and understand what was being sold, they simply would not buy anything, and Gail would end up broke. With that, he waved and walked back to his position. Gail thought to himself about how unexpectedly kind a man had been. After all the contempt and mockery he had received from Kush and the others, this simple act of helpfulness hit him more deeply than he had expected. He found himself crying quietly about it. He reached inside his shirt and touched the necklace he had been keeping close. He had genuinely liked it, but circumstances being what they were, he needed the income. He placed it on one of the hooks in the display. He told himself it was time to get to work. It was his first time doing anything like this, and the nervousness was setting in. He wondered what the people of the town thought about cursed items, whether they would be open to them at all, or whether they would simply be put off by the very idea. He gave himself a firm slap on the face to shake himself out of his hesitation. Then he took a breath and launched into it, calling out loudly to the people passing by, inviting them to come and take a look at what he had on offer. He announced that he had debuff items and everything an adventurer could need, all at bargain prices. The response was immediate. One man stopped and pointed out that he had talismans, remarking that they were quite rare. Gail greeted him warmly. A woman nearby raised a skeptical eyebrow and questioned whether cursed items were really more useful than simply hiring a debuffing mage. Gail explained his case patiently, acknowledging that cursed items were generally single-use and were often considered a step down from what a skilled mage could do, but pointing out that they could be used by absolutely anyone without requiring any magical power whatsoever, which made them genuinely appealing to a certain kind of adventurer. The people listening seemed genuinely impressed by the explanation. Another man picked up a venom talisman and noted with surprise that it was priced at only 5 copper, saying that was remarkably cheap. Gail confirmed the price and explained that he crafted them from monster materials and ingredients he produced himself, which meant the cost of production was almost nothing. What the customer was really paying for was his time and effort in making them. He went on to describe the broader range of what he had available, including talismans that caused various effects, items that inflicted ailments, things that adjusted stats, and various other debuff tools. The man said that at that price, he was willing to take a chance, and Gail thanked him. Then something on the display caught the man's eye, and he asked about it. Gail explained that it was a cursed short sword. Equipping it caused a slight reduction in agility, but applied an anti-armor effect to any monster the wielder fought against. As a side effect, it also boosted all other stats by 10%. He added that it was cursed. The man reacted with visible alarm and nearly dropped the item, which did fall to the ground, and he asked in a startled voice to confirm what Gail had just said. Gail asked whether he meant the anti-armor effect. The man clarified that it was the last part, the cursed part, that had thrown him. Gail confirmed it plainly. The man scratched his head and said he appreciated the honesty, but wondered aloud who on earth would want to buy a cursed blade. Gail acknowledged it was a fair point and suggested an alternative use. He asked whether the grip and overall design might not work well as a decorative piece in someone's home. The man looked at it and considered the idea. He admitted that while it was genuinely unsettling, he did not actually dislike the design. He agreed to the deal, reasoning that something so creepy might even serve the purpose of warding off evil spirits. Gail thanked him and, as a goodwill gesture, threw in 3 dispel talismans free of charge to give the man a way to remove the curse if needed. The man was pleasantly surprised by the generosity and thanked him. Gail thought it was simply the right thing to do. From that point on, Gail made a habit of being completely transparent with every customer, explaining exactly what each curse did and how it could be removed if necessary. The approach worked, and things began to sell steadily. One item drawing particular attention was the cursed necklace he had placed on display, which boosted all stats by 50%, but was, as with everything else on his stall, cursed. One customer was drawn to the bold and flashy design of the item he was looking at and decided to take it. Gail had already added several dispel talismans to it as part of the deal. The item in question was a pair of curse boots that granted 2.5 times the wearer's normal agility, with the trade-off being the curse attached to them. A woman who came by said she would pass the boots along to her slave, and Gail made sure to include extra talismans with that purchase as well. He then presented his next item, a cursed crossbow that boosted all of the wearer's stats by 30% and came with a sure shot effect, at the cost of also being cursed. The customer who took it mentioned he intended to use it in an upcoming annual hunting competition. Once the transaction was done, Gail saw him off warmly and sent him on his way with around 5 dispel talismans tucked in alongside his purchase. Gail let out a quiet sigh as the steady flow of customers continued. Another man approached and wanted to know more about what kind of goods Gail was selling. Gail launched into an explanation, drawing on a story he had once heard about a legendary hero whose closest companion had been a berserker with a deep passion for cursed equipment, a warrior whose prized possession had apparently been a cursed suit of armor. Gail acknowledged that many people had an instinctive and strong aversion to anything with a curse on it, which was precisely why he made a point of explaining each curse in full, including how to lift it, what benefits the item carried despite the curse, and why the dispel talismans he included made the whole thing manageable. More men drifted toward his stall as he spoke, murmuring among themselves with impressed surprise at the fact that he was including free dispel talismans with every purchase, remarking that such generosity was almost unheard of. Gail called out to draw in more attention, advertising his full lineup of cursed equipment at low prices with talismans included. By the end of the day, the stall had been picked completely clean. Every single item was sold. His bag, once weighed down with goods, now felt almost weightless. He had served all manner of customers throughout the day, and the variety of people who had shown interest had been genuinely wide. One particular comment stuck in his memory. A customer who had looked over the selection and declared that his stuff had an intense, almost death metal energy to it, pointing out one item in particular as especially striking. Just as Gail was winding down, he heard footsteps approaching quickly. A group of men arrived and asked if this was the stall selling cursed items with dispel talismans and whether anything was left. Gail told them everything was gone. The 3 were visibly disappointed. It became clear that the free talismans had been a far bigger draw than Gail had anticipated. A genuine surprise hit. One of the men said with regret that he should have come before heading out on their quest. The group turned to Gail and asked whether, if they brought their own gear to him, he could curse it and provide them with dispel talismans. Gail told them he would be back at the stall the following day and then promptly made his exit before the conversation could go any further. Elsewhere, some of the customers who had bought from his stall were already trying out their new purchases. One of them teased his companion not to pass out from fear, knowing the other had a particular dread of anything curse-related. Despite his nerves, the hesitant one put the ring on, and the moment he checked his stats, he was completely floored. He declared it unbelievable and showed his companion immediately. The companion reacted with equal disbelief. The ring had genuinely boosted the wearer's stats by 50%, all from a single piece of equipment. Both of them marveled at whether it was really acceptable for one item to carry that much power. The other customers who had made purchases were having similarly astonished reactions to what they had gotten their hands on. The 2 men were elated. As far as they were concerned, cursed or not, there was no chance they were taking these items off. One of them did raise a practical concern. The church charged an enormous amount to lift curses, so much so that he wondered aloud whether there might be a way to make money by reselling the dispel talismans Gail had provided. His companion immediately told him to stop talking like that, especially in public, warning that if any priests overheard them suggesting ways to undercut church services, there would be serious consequences. The first man agreed, but could not help noting just how steep the church's dispel prices were, charged in gold coins. The conversation drifted to the crafter himself, with both men agreeing that whoever had made these items must have been extraordinarily skilled. One of them predicted that every guild and party in the area would soon be hunting for this person. They wondered who he even was, and when cursed crafters had started being so energetic and approachable. One of them had the nagging feeling he might have seen the man somewhere before, but could not place it. What these two adventurers, whispering their curiosity to each other, did not and could not know was the full truth of the person they were discussing. They had no way of knowing that this crafter had voluntarily taken on the curses of 4 different people, absorbing those burdens into himself as his way of contributing to his party. Nor could they have imagined that a crafter capable of producing items powerful enough to push an entire party to S rank had been thrown out of that very party and reduced to selling off his work at bargain prices from small roadside stall. From that day forward, the mysterious crafter who appeared unpredictably at his stall would become the subject of quiet, spreading rumors among adventurers. Gail, for his part, was in good spirits as he walked away, reflecting that even a modest amount of money did remarkable things for a person's mood. That same day, his former party was somewhere deep in the forest, in the middle of a quest that was going very badly. A thunderous impact split the air, and a tree was cleaved clean in half by the force of something powerful. Another impact followed, and Kush was sent flying backward into a tree trunk, his back slamming against it hard. The group was in a state of disbelief and frustration, unable to comprehend how things had gotten so out of hand. They were an S-rank party. This was not supposed to be happening to them. A massive monster filled the space before them and let out a deafening roar. Kush, battered and barely holding his ground, stared at the creature in outraged exhaustion, unable to understand why it simply would not go down. He was face to face with an ogre, and it showed no sign of stopping. At the start of the 3rd chapter, Melissa was expressing concern about whether the party would be all right going into an S-rank quest with a brand new member. Kush brushed off the worry and said they would be fine, explaining that he had personally vetted her and that she was considered one of the best the guild had to offer. Luke assumed she would be able to adapt to their rhythm without much trouble. The others smiled at her with expectation, and she smiled back pleasantly. Kush then spotted a monster nearby and suggested they treat it as a warm-up exercise before the real quest. What followed was not the smooth demonstration of strength any of them had expected. Even Kush was close to being exhausted by the encounter. Luke tried to use his bow, but the arrow nearly hit Melissa instead of the monster, leaving her demanding to know what he was doing. He said his aim fell off somehow, and he could not explain why. Before Melissa could finish dismissing the situation since it was only an ogre, she was struck by the monster and sent flying into a tree alongside Luke. Kush called out to Norris and asked how long his spell was going to take to cast. Norris was under pressure, and when he finally managed to release something, it produced only a tiny flame. Kush was furious and could not understand how they were supposed to win a fight with magic that weak. He was in the middle of shouting at Norris when a monster crept up directly behind him without any of them noticing. A voice suddenly cried out a warning, and Kush was yanked out of harm's way by a surge of magic. It was Moria. She asked if he was all right. Kush demanded to know what she was doing standing around and told her to start buffing the party immediately. She told him plainly that she had been buffing everyone continuously throughout the entire fight and was already nearly out of magic power because of it. She spun her weapon and drove it into the ground, producing a series of bright flashes and a gleam of light directly beneath Kush. She told him his stats had been doubled from their normal levels and that he should be able to take down an A-rank monster without difficulty at that strength. Kush grabbed the opportunity and charged at the ogre with full confidence. The result was not what he expected. He swung his sword with everything he had, but the monster simply caught the blade in its hand, seemingly treating the whole encounter as a game. Kush was shocked. The ogre lifted the sword with Kush still holding it and flung him away effortlessly. As the monster turned and began charging toward him again, Kush scrambled to get away. He blamed Moria as he ran, calling her worthless and questioning what she meant by doubling their stats if this was the result. Moria shot back with obvious frustration, pointing out that he had been the one who had initially told her not to waste buffs yet and to save them for the behemoth. Since he was now criticizing her, she said she would go ahead and use the debuff item that had been left behind. She told him it could be used to weaken the ogre significantly. Kush grabbed her by the collar and demanded to know if she was seriously suggesting they use cursed items from Gail. He dismissed the idea entirely, saying that kind of thing would never work in this situation. Moria held up a letter she had been carrying. It was addressed to her from Gail, and it explained that he wanted to help pass the baton smoothly and had left notes about the Wolfpack's battle style and what he had done to support them, along with an invitation to make use of the cursed items he had left behind. Moria explained that this was precisely why she had brought it. She asked Kush directly whether the party had not previously used curse debuffs on enemies before engaging them in battle, because that had clearly been the approach before she had joined. Kush shoved her to the ground in response. The pieces then began falling into place for Kush. It dawned on him that the magic circles they had seen the previous day had not been a dispel at all. It had been Gail placing curses on them. Melissa agreed that it must have been what happened. Luke claimed he had known it all along. The party decided to withdraw for the day and directed their anger at Gail as they retreated. Kush reminded himself that this was a highway known to be filled with A-rank monsters, a route that experienced adventurers traveled regularly, but that an S-rank party like them had no business being unable to handle it. Luke acknowledged Cush's frustration, but pointed out that as long as Gail's curse was affecting them and keeping them from operating at full capacity, it made more sense to withdraw and deal with the problem properly before taking on anything serious. Norris suggested calling it a strategic retreat rather than a defeat. Melissa agreed, and they noted that the ogre had already lost interest in them and wandered off. Cush announced they were heading back and said there was no point dwelling on the curse. Moria was stunned by how quickly they were giving up. She pointed out that they were an S-rank party and questioned whether retreating this early was really appropriate. Cush then looked her over and noted that she had not taken much damage compared to the rest of them. The others picked up on this and commented that she had barely even fought during the encounter. They told her to guard the rear as they left. Moria was outraged. She pointed out that she was a support mage, a role that was almost by definition not meant to be the last line of physical defense. Cush dismissed her objections and told her to get moving. The party fled the scene, leaving Moria behind. The ogre, which had been listening to the entire exchange, made a brief comment to Moria, expressing something like sympathy for her situation. The two of them were left alone together. Moria's fury boiled over completely. She crumpled the letter in her hand and flung it into the air, yelling her frustration at what she had just experienced. She was ready to go after every single one of them. But then the paper unfolded in midair and flashed brightly, releasing a huge cloud of smoke. In her rage, she launched herself forward ready to tear after the party. Meanwhile, the rest of the Wolfpack had walked a significant distance before collapsing with exhaustion and nausea. They stopped to rest. Norris lamented that he had dropped his favorite belongings somewhere along the way. They all felt like they had nearly died. Cush was in disbelief that an ogre had driven them to this state. Melissa said she did not understand why the new girl was not helping them the way they had expected. Under normal circumstances, they would have had no trouble handling multiple ogres at once. Something was clearly not right with all of them that day. They should not have been this exhausted simply from running. Cush said it was obvious something was wrong. Melissa blamed Moria entirely and made a dismissive and uncharitable comment about her appearance. The three men glanced at her and then quickly looked away, silently thinking to themselves that her comment made no sense in that context. Norris pushed back and said that could not explain what was happening to them. Even before Moria had started buffing them, the sharpness had already gone from all of their movements. Luke agreed and brought up how long it had taken Norris just to cast his spell, calling it embarrassing. Norris countered by asking what Luke would have done in his position, insisting that under normal conditions what he had attempted would have reduced the monster to ash instantly. Cush concluded that everything was Gail's fault and began thinking about how to make him pay for it. Eventually Moria caught up with them, panting but with her eyes fixed on them with a sharp and barely contained fury. Cush remarked that it had taken her long enough to shake off the ogre. Then he noticed something strange clinging to her back, but said nothing more about it for the moment. Back in the town, Gail was making his way along with all of his goods, reflecting on the experience of running a stall. He was enjoying it more than he had expected, though he found himself wishing that more ordinary city residents would stop by rather than just adventurers. Some regular townspeople had browsed his display, but had been hesitant to commit to any purchases. Most of what he had sold had gone to adventurers or to people specifically seeking out his dispel talismans. He began thinking it might be time to try a different location. The merchant from the guild happened to pass by and struck up a conversation, observing that Gail's goods seemed to be selling well. Gail confirmed this and said thank you. He mentioned he was considering moving his stall somewhere nearby. The merchant thought it over and suggested the Noble Quarter, which was only about 10 yards away or close to it. He explained his reasoning. Ordinary people tended to shop primarily based on practical need, but wealthy nobles were different. They were interested in things they could display and show off, and they were always drawn to whatever was considered fashionable and forward-thinking. If nobles began to see Gail's cursed items as high-end decorative pieces, it would position him as someone on the cutting edge of interior design. It might even lead to commissions decorating the interiors of private estates. The merchant also mentioned, with some careful wording, that moving away from the current location might also be wise given that a certain adventurer with a particularly unsettling gaze had been stopping by regularly, the kind of look that made people instinctively nervous. On that note, the merchant said it was time to get back to another productive day of business. Gail's stall was set up and ready. Neither of them noticed that someone was watching him quietly from a distance. When Moria finally rejoined her party, they were already criticizing her for being late. Melissa offered her own theory for the delay, suggesting it was probably due to the large and heavy milk jugs Moria had been hauling around. Luke dismissed her with the air of someone speaking to someone beneath them, framing the whole ordeal as a lesson she had needed to learn. Norris cut the chatter short and told everyone it was time to head back. Moria had no idea what any of them were referring to and was still trying to make sense of it when Cush's attention suddenly shifted to something directly behind her. The cursed item that Gail had used to suppress the ogre had worn off completely, and the creature was now reverting to its true and enormous eyes right behind Moria. She took one look at what was happening, declared flatly that there was absolutely no way she was taking responsibility for that situation on her own, and turned and ran without another word. She called back to the others as she fled, pointing out that a single person could not reasonably be expected to handle something like this, and that they should step up and deal with it themselves. Kush shouted after her that it was her job as rear guard to handle exactly this kind of threat, but Moria did not slow down. The ogre turned its full attention to the remaining party members and began stomping toward them. The group was visibly rattled. Melissa pushed the others forward and told them to handle it. Panic set in quickly, but Luke managed to pull together enough composure to call out to the ogre, making a remark about how much more appealing and tender the flesh of women was compared to other options. Having delivered this dubious contribution to the situation, the entire group promptly turned and sprinted away. The ogre considered the suggestion for a moment before dismissing it entirely, as it happened to be a vegetarian. For days past, the party sat slumped around a table at an inn, looking utterly worn out and defeated. Kush was calling for water. Melissa was desperately longing for a bath, still unable to believe that after fleeing the ogre they had somehow managed to get completely lost in whichever forest they had ended up running into. The other people in the room were uncomfortable, shifting away from the group and covering their noses, unable to ignore the powerful smell rising off the party. The stench was very real. The woman working behind the counter spotted them and asked Moria whether that sorry group sitting over there belonged to her. Moria confirmed it without any particular sympathy, adding that they had brought it on themselves. She noted that despite everything, they were still finding ways to blame Gail for their troubles. Meanwhile, Kush was hollering at the innkeeper, demanding at minimum some water or a towel. Luke complained that the service at the establishment was terrible. The innkeeper's response was to slam a single glass of water onto the table and inform them plainly that this was all they were getting, and that it was not complimentary. Kush bristled at her tone and demanded to know who she thought she was talking to them like that. The innkeeper showed no sign of being impressed, informing them that the answer was quite obvious to her. They were freeloaders, plain and simple. The party reacted with indignation, but before they could get very far with their protest, the innkeeper cut through it, telling them that their payment had only covered them through the previous day. Once they finished that water, they were expected to leave, unless they intended to pay for another night. Kush drew himself up and reminded her with great self-importance that they were an S-rank party. He reached into his bag to back this up with actual coin. The bag was empty. He searched through it more carefully, his expression shifting. The rest of the party urged him to stop stalling and just pay, and then they noticed that his face had gone completely pale. The full picture of the party's financial situation became painfully clear as Kush mentally accounted for where everything had gone. Melissa had spent a considerable sum on beauty products, all of which were now battered and ruined from the ogre encounter. Luke had purchased a new dagger because he simply liked having new things. Equipment maintenance had taken another significant portion. Kush's gauntlets had been completely shattered during the battle. A new magic book and staff had been necessary after the old ones were damaged beyond use. And Kush's custom-ordered longsword, the one made specifically for him, had been chipped so severely during the fight with the ogre that it could not be salvaged. When everything was tallied up, the conclusion was unavoidable. The Wolfpack was completely and thoroughly broke. The innkeeper laid out the bill without ceremony. 1 silver per person per night came to 5 silvers total, with an additional silver on top if meals were to be included. The party sat in tense and miserable silence, their expressions saying everything their mouths could not. The innkeeper asked them directly whether they could pay or not. While this standoff hung in the air, Melissa found herself focused on a much more immediate concern. She was extremely thirsty. Her eyes settled on the single glass of water sitting on the table. Before anyone could react, she picked it up and drank the entire thing in one long swallow. The others lunged toward her to stop her, but it was already gone. At the same time, across the room at the counter, Moria had quietly ordered herself a mug of ale and a meal, apparently using money of her own. The 3 party members who had been frozen in disbelief over the water now turned in unison to stare at her. The implication was immediately obvious. She had been holding out on the shared party fund. Nora stated that this was simply not acceptable. Luke declared himself deeply shocked. Moria pushed back without hesitation, stating that the money she was spending was entirely her own personal funds. She reminded them that the arrangement had always been for request reward money to go into the shared pool. The others immediately tried to rewrite history, with Kush insisting she was being ridiculous and that such rules only kicked in once a request had actually been completed. Melissa agreed, grabbed hold of Moria, and announced with brazen cheerfulness that whatever belonged to Moria also belonged to the party, while whatever belonged to the party naturally also belonged to the party. They held her in place and told her that if she had a problem with any of it, she was welcome to go and complain to Gail. They took her money. When they looked inside her pouch, they were pleasantly surprised by the amount inside, and made admiring remarks about how well support mages apparently got paid. Moria stood behind them with her teeth clenched, quietly declaring to herself that she was going to destroy all of them. Kush laughed at the threat, pointing out that as a support mage her offensive capability was roughly equivalent to being bitten by a mosquito. He did not finish the sentence. Moria's fist drove into his face in a sharp uppercut before the words were fully out of his mouth, and he dropped to the floor. The other 3 stared in stunned disbelief. Melissa grabbed the nearest chair and swung it at Moria with full force, only to find that it passed through nothing but clothing. Moria had already moved out of the way. A moment later, Melissa was struck hard from behind as Moria reappeared and landed a solid punch on her. The remaining 2 members tried to talk Moria down and get her to stop. She told them loudly and with considerable heat to keep their mouths shut. Luke warned her that she would regret what she was saying. The 2 of them charged at her together. A magic circle burst into light beneath Moria's feet at that exact moment. As they launched themselves toward her, she leapt straight up into the air and came down squarely on top of both of their heads. The other guests in the inn watched in stunned silence as Moria stood over all 4 of her downed party members, the clear and undisputed winner of the entire brawl. She wiped her forehead with one hand and broke into a wide, satisfied grin. Moria turned to the innkeeper and apologized for the destruction the brawl had caused, assuring her that she would cover the cost of any damage. The innkeeper, surprisingly, told her not to worry about it. If anything, she felt the place had been cleaned up. With that settled, Moria turned to face her party and announced plainly that she was done. As of that day, she was leaving the group. Across the city, Gail was at his stall attending to a customer who had the appearance of someone from the nobility. The woman had been drawn in by the unusual items on display and found herself particularly taken with a lantern bearing what she described as a lizard design. Gail noted internally that it was actually a basilisk, not a lizard, but kept that to himself and instead told her she had a sharp eye. He explained to her that what she was looking at was a cursed oil lamp. The woman immediately recoiled in alarm. Her guard moved forward at once, positioning himself between her and Gail and demanding to know whether Gail was attempting to sell cursed goods to someone of high standing. Gail assured him firmly that he was doing no such thing and that the lamp was simply a decorative piece. The guard pressed him to explain further. Gail let out a quiet sigh. He thought back over how the interaction had unfolded. He had described the lamp as providing a charm effect, set his asking price high, and the woman had exceeded it without even needing to be encouraged. Moments like that were gratifying, but popular or not, everything at his stall was still handmade equipment. Items designed for single use in battle were not drawing much attention at all. Still, he decided the day had been decent enough. It was time to pack up. As he reflected on the day, he noticed a pattern in how the noble customers had responded to his work. They used words like curious and interesting when looking at his items, but not one of them had said outright that they liked what they saw. He wondered if his style was simply too unusual for that crowd. He stood holding one of his pieces and letting the thoughts settle over him when a voice nearby asked if he was closing up for the day. He turned to find a young woman browsing through his remaining items. He studied her quietly. She was dressed plainly enough that noble status seemed unlikely, though something about her suggested she was not an ordinary commoner either. He caught himself wondering if she might be someone from a wealthy household who had slipped out without permission. He glanced in the direction she had come from and noticed what appeared to be a guard standing at a distance. The young woman was moving through his items with genuine interest, and she remarked that his work was unconventional, but that was precisely the kind of thing she was drawn to. Gail was caught completely off guard. She then picked up a ring and called it genuinely cute. It was the first time anyone had complimented his designs directly, and the sincerity of it made him flush. He told her she had real taste to recognize it for what it was. He was not entirely sure of her background, but she had clearly gone to some trouble to dress down and blend in. It felt wrong to treat her with stiff formality. He mentioned that he was about to close and offered to give her a good deal as a result. The young woman immediately insisted that she had left her purse somewhere. She started to say a word that she quickly caught herself on, covering her mouth and smoothly recovering, saying only that her money was back at home and she did not have much with her at the moment. Gail caught on to what she had almost let slip and laughed, telling her that whatever she had on her was perfectly fine. She was the first customer to say something kind about his designs, and that counted for something, though he added that she should not go spreading that around to his regulars. She laughed and agreed, saying she would take the ring and hand him something in return. When he opened his palm to look, he found a single large gold coin sitting there. He was stunned that she was casually carrying something like that on what was supposed to be a discreet outing. He tried to call after her, but she had already flashed him a grin and waved as she walked away. He stood there thinking she was charming, and then felt a chill when he noticed a figure nearby watching him with a stern and unfriendly expression. Then it hit him. He had completely forgotten to describe the item to her, and he had not given her any dispel talismans to go with it. He looked around. She was already gone. He had no idea what to do. He tried to reassure himself by thinking through what he had actually sold her. It had only been a cursed memorial ring, and the curse on it was not a particularly severe one. The effect, while significant, was not alarming on its own. The ring tripled the wearer's defense and granted resistance against instant kill effects. The problem was that, like all cursed items, once it was on, it could not be removed. However, if she was as wealthy as that gold coin suggested, she could easily afford a visit to a church to have the curse lifted professionally. He resolved that when he saw her again, he would apologize and make sure she had plenty of dispel talismans. But then a thought crept in. Had she been about to say the word castle earlier before catching herself? Not far away, the young woman was suddenly grabbed from multiple directions and pulled into an alley. She fought and struggled, demanding to be released and wanting to know why they were laying hands on her. A woman's voice confirmed to the soldiers that they had caught her, and they were signaled to move. The young woman continued to resist as they moved her along. Later, back at the castle, the soldiers were visibly exhausted and slumped from the effort of the whole ordeal. The woman addressed the young lady with strained patience, asking her to please stop making things so difficult for everyone around her, reminding her firmly of who she was, Princess Kara. The princess did not look particularly pleased to be back. Meanwhile, Gale was walking away from a stall when a hand landed on his back and a voice called out to him. The person explained that they were looking for a young man with black hair and a blue jacket who ran a nearby stall, a description that matched Gale exactly, and wanted to get a look at his face. Gale turned around. He asked the man, with a carefully casual expression, whether he really looked young enough to fit that description. The man studied him for a moment, apologized, and walked away. Gale slipped into a hidden alley and used a dispel on himself, letting out a shaken breath. He had no idea why the capital's military was looking for him, but the answer to that question could wait. What he knew for certain was that he needed to pack up and leave the city as quickly as possible. A group of children who had been watching nearby were delighted by what they had just witnessed, asking what kind of magic trick that was and demanding he do it again. Gale put a firm finger to his lips and silenced them. At the opening of Chapter 6, Vivian was lecturing Princess Kara about the ring she had acquired, declaring that such an item was an outright affront to the church. Kara seemed entirely unbothered, pointing out that mixing with the people of the city was something they were supposed to do anyway. Vivian conceded the point, but looked around Kara's room, which was crammed full of all manner of collected items, and told the princess plainly that she did not share her enthusiasm for that particular style of design. Kara addressed her by name and suggested lightly that Vivian simply had some growing to do in that regard. Vivian pressed on, reminding Kara that she had a meeting with a foreign envoy first thing that morning and needed to move quickly. Before she could even finish the sentence, she stopped herself, alarmed by what she was seeing. Kara was in the process of trying to ring on. Vivian demanded to know whether she was actually planning to wear it to the meeting. Kara said she was not. She only wanted to try it on briefly. Elsewhere, Gale sat at a table in the Adventurers Guild with a meal in front of him. He took a bite and found it good. He reflected on how things had been going since he had struck out on his own, and found himself pleasantly surprised by how well it had worked out. He wondered privately if he might actually have a natural talent for this kind of independent work. That said, he knew he would need to gather more materials soon. Salvaging and repairing scrap goods was not going to bring in serious money over the long run. He began thinking about taking on a few solid-looking quests and then moving on to another town. He started heading downstairs and immediately pulled back out of sight. His former party was at the counter. They were making their case to the woman working there, insisting she should put up investment money for them given that they were an S-rank party, throwing out figures of 10 or 20 gold coins as if the request were perfectly reasonable. The guild woman told them with obvious reluctance that financing was difficult to justify when they had made no meaningful progress on any quest since receiving their promotion. Kush pushed back, suggesting they still had time on their side. The woman asked whether they had even met with their client yet. Kush implied they did not have to, but the woman informed them that the client had already filed a complaint, feeling deliberately ignored by a party that was supposedly S-rank. The party muttered something about running into trouble with a monster. The woman acknowledged the ogre, noted that it was technically an A-rank creature, and asked pointedly why an S-rank party had struggled with it to the degree they had. They tried to claim it had been a mutant variant. The woman stated flatly that it had been a completely ordinary ogre. She also made clear that she was fully aware they had kept the ogre's aggression aimed at themselves and led it all the way back to town, and that this was far from the only error in judgment they had made recently. She asked if they genuinely believed the guild would not notice these things. Kush responded with a rude remark about her directness. The woman continued, noting that Moria had walked out of their party within just a few days of joining it. The Silver Wolf had sent both a complaint and an invoice to the guild, which the guild had covered on their behalf, meaning the party now owed the guild money. Gale, still hidden and watching all of this, quietly observed that Kush and the others were in serious trouble, and noted that they looked terrible on top of everything else. The woman then brought her fist down on the counter. She asked them, with barely contained patience, whether they were seriously still talking about investment money, and challenged them to try saying it one more time. Kush, seething, turned and placed the blame squarely on Gale. Gale was taken aback from his hiding spot. The party claimed that because of the curses Gale had placed on them, their stats had collapsed, and even magical buffs were barely doing anything for them anymore. Gale could not understand the logic. All he had done was remove his own curses from himself, not place new ones on them. Luke piled on, adding that Moria had been useless as well. Norris agreed. The woman said she had heard enough. She informed them that among support mages, Moria ranked within the top 5 in the entire capital. She had previously encountered difficulty with another party, and the guild had referred her to what they had believed was a capable group. The party was visibly stunned. None of them had known she was that highly ranked. Even Gale, still listening from out of sight, was genuinely surprised by that. He also noted to himself that she had already left them, which made the whole thing even more remarkable. The woman then turned to the matter of Gale and said she could not understand why they were pinning any blame on him at all. She pointed out that curse crafters of his caliber were not easy to come by, and asked whether they had any real idea what his dispel talismans alone were worth on the open market. Gale felt his face go warm hearing himself spoken about that way. He recalled that he had occasionally made talismans for the guild as a side arrangement, something he had done quietly without much fanfare. The woman wrapped up by making herself very clear. They were to repay what they owed before the subject of any investment could even be raised. Cush declared they would handle it immediately and rounded up the others to leave. Melissa brought up Gail's name as they moved, and Norris cut in to say they needed to focus on picking up a quest they could actually complete right now. Luke agreed, saying there would be no more S-rank quests until whatever was affecting their stats was sorted out. Cush told them all to stop talking, and they stamped out of the building. The other people nearby murmured to one another, questioning whether that was really an S-rank party and agreeing that they were not what anyone would have expected. Gail lingered behind in his hiding spot, puzzling over all the talk about a curse still affecting them. He had removed his curses from himself a long time ago and could not account for what they were experiencing. He hoped they would be all right, but more urgently, he decided he needed to get out of the building before they spotted him and decided to take their frustrations out on him directly. He stepped outside and almost immediately noticed a cluster of guards rushing past. He caught pieces of their conversation as they went. There was apparently some kind of major disturbance, and the source of it was Princess Cara and Vivian having one of their intense confrontations, the kind that apparently escalated to physical chaos very quickly and required a significant number of people to bring under control. Gail was quietly astonished that the capital's army was regularly mobilized for something like that. He passed by a merchant's shop and decided to stop in while he was in the area, pushing open the door to the sound of clanking. Back at the castle, the situation was already in full crisis. Guards were trying to calm Vivian down, reminding her where she was and urging her to collect herself. Vivian was having none of it, telling them not to dare get in her way. The cause of her fury became clear. Princess Cara had the ring on her finger, and it would not come off. Vivian recounted with exasperation that she had warned the princess not to put it on, but Cara had insisted she only wanted to try it for a moment. Once it was on her finger, neither of them had been able to remove it despite both trying. An older man approached the princess and told her sternly to take the ring off immediately. Cara responded with a note of helpless honesty that she was not entirely able to do that. Vivian, at the end of her patience, announced that as far as she could see, there was only one option remaining. The finger would have to come off along with the ring. A woman drew her sword and declared urgently that the princess had to accept what she was about to do, as there was no time left before the meeting was due to begin. Everyone around them erupted in panic, shouting for the princess to be protected. The following day, the princess expressed her gratitude to the waiting envoys for their patience. When they caught sight of her, they bowed respectfully and offered a compliment on her appearance. She thanked them warmly. One of them noticed something on her finger and asked about it. She laughed lightly and explained that she had simply cut herself. The truth, which she kept to herself, was that there had been no time to remove the ring before the announcement of the envoy's arrival had been made. She then invited the envoys to sit and suggested that tea might be in order after their long journey. The envoys declined her offer and said that since they were there, they had instead brought a selection of fine tea and snacks from the Empire that they would very much like her to try. They gestured toward an unusually large crate that had been brought in. The princess remarked with some surprise at the sheer size of it, noting that they had brought quite a lot. The envoy confirmed this cheerfully and encouraged her to see what the Empire had prepared for her enjoyment. What emerged from the crate was not food. It was a group of bandits armed with daggers. The envoy explained in a cold tone that the poison coating the blades was fast-acting and that her death would be painless. The room erupted. Everyone cried out to protect the princess, and Vivian ordered the soldiers to attack. The envoy declared it was too late and moved to strike. The weapons were aimed directly at the princess, but something extraordinary happened. The blades could not reach her. Every spear and weapon that came close simply bounced away as though deflected by an invisible force. The attackers were stunned. The princess herself did not understand what had just happened. The envoy ordered the assault to continue, but the result was the same every time. Everything bounced back harmlessly. The assailants and the guards alike stared at each other in complete confusion, unable to make sense of why a barrier had appeared around the princess. The princess stood quietly for a moment, and then the realization began to form. She thought back to a memory of Gail, who had once told her she was the first customer to compliment his designs. She understood. Vivian immediately commanded the guards to seize the envoys. She turned to the princess and asked if she was hurt. The princess said she was perfectly fine. Vivian found herself puzzling over the situation, wondering why someone would go to the trouble of impersonating envoys from the Empire. But she set the question aside for the moment and told the princess they needed to move somewhere safe until the situation had been fully secured. Later, in the Star Chamber, two men examined what had happened with expressions of shock. They turned to a bishop and a man named Appraising for their assessment and asked whether they were dealing with a harmful curse. The bishop said that it was not harmful and that dispelling it would actually be quite straightforward. What was remarkable was the level of craft involved. Whoever had made this clearly possessed a deep and specialized understanding of cursed items. The ring had been infused with a high-ranking curse specifically designed to amplify the positive effects it generated to their maximum potential. Under normal circumstances, this would also produce an equally massive and unwanted negative side effect, but by layering several reciprocal curses on top of one another with extraordinary precision, those negative effects have been effectively canceled out. He continued at length with his explanation, though the princess struggled to follow the technical details. The bishop said there was more he could add, but he would let the appraiser have his turn. Arizel, the appraiser, took over and said that as remarkable as it was to say, the ring tripled the wearer's defense and provided resistance to instantly lethal attacks. Vivian was visibly shaken by this assessment. She asked what that meant in practical terms. Arizel explained that it placed the ring on the level of a cursed holy relic. He expressed personal amazement that he was witnessing something of this caliber so early in his career, at which point something came down firmly on his head. It was Vivian who had struck him and made clear she was going to keep doing so if he did not stop holding Kara's hand. Vivian then noted that another church relic, something known as the Angel Shield, provided a similar kind of protective effect. The appraiser confirmed this and explained that it too offered resistance against instantly fatal blows. The bishop said he had never personally encountered anything else that offered the same effect at such a scale, with one exception. He mentioned the Empire's greatest known treasure, a legendary item called the Heart of the Devil. This item was known to provide an extraordinary range of high-level effects, including resistance to instant death, stat boosts, reduced casting time for magic, and more. However, it came at a devastating price, draining the life force of whoever wielded it, and if the drain was not dispelled in time, it would kill the wearer. Vivian reflected that this was the nature of such powerful items in their world. The price matched the power, and anyone who wanted effects of that magnitude had to be prepared to pay that cost. But this ring was different. It carried almost no penalty at all. That meant it was not simply on the level of a holy relic. It was a holy relic in its own right, or possibly something even beyond that category. The princess quietly called Vivian's name and asked whether she remembered the man who had sold it to her. Vivian said she did remember his face. She looked at the princess carefully and asked whether she wanted her to find him so that he could be dealt with. The princess said no, absolutely not. She wanted him found so that she could thank him properly. Cursed or not, the ring had saved her life. Whatever its nature, she wanted to see him again. At the start of Chapter 6, Gail was getting himself ready to leave the capital. He had put on a cloak with side pockets for carrying gear and found that he liked it well enough. He was also wearing wireline sleeves that offered additional storage, along with boots built for the road that had protective padding inside. He had his equipment sorted and his handmade dagger on him, and decided he would pick up whatever else he needed along the way. He took one last look over the city as the morning air settled cool and crisp around him, and the streets began filling with the sounds of people starting their day, breaking the stillness that had held the town through the early hours. It struck him as a strange feeling, finally leaving the capital like this. He had not expected to feel anything particular about it, but something lingered as he walked. When he passed by a shadowed alley, something made him glance in, and what he saw stopped him cold for a moment. It was his former guild party, huddled together in the cold. He could hear them bickering among themselves in the familiar, grating way they always had. He shook his head and convinced himself he did not know those people, then kept walking. The city was busy by the time he reached the market area. He caught fragments of conversations around him, people talking about needing more hands somewhere, others arguing that the palace guard on the gate was sufficient. Then he heard the sound of hooves and looked up to see the royal knight corps riding through. He was puzzled by their presence, and even more so when he spotted the capital army alongside them. Something was clearly happening. Then he saw the posted notice. It described a young man in his late teens, scruffy in appearance, selling what it called tacky decorative goods on the street, with black hair. Anyone who spotted him was to contact the castle or the nearest soldier or knight immediately. The knights nearby were discussing their search, noting that they had checked the plaza, the inns, and the guild, and had asked everywhere without success. Gale stood nearby, doing his best to look as though none of this had anything to do with him. He reminded himself that the last time they had a description of him, it had been more accurate. This new one did not quite fit. For one thing, his goods were not tacky, and that detail stung him a little despite everything. One of the knights complained about how little useful information they had to work with and glanced over at Gale, noting that the city was full of scruffy young men around the right age. He looked at Gale directly and sized him up. Gale asked what the matter was. The knight observed that Gale's gear had a certain look to it, but he was clearly not a seller. Gale was quietly offended at having his gear called tacky, but said nothing that would make things worse. The knight talked himself out of it, reasoning that the person they were looking for would not be dressed as neatly as Gale was, and that the man they wanted supposedly sold morbid things and would look considerably dirtier. Gale agreed with the knight's reasoning and was waved on his way. He stopped by a wall for a moment and quietly acknowledged to himself that he was being foolish for feeling sentimental about a city he was trying to leave. He told himself to just get out and moved on toward the gate. At the gate, there were a great many stagecoaches gathered at that hour, which gave him options. He turned the question over in his mind. Where to go? A large town would suit him best for work. He considered Emirates, which was a major trade hub not far away. There was also Gracia's Fort, which served as a military center, or he could go further to Grandstadt, the old city. While he was still weighing it, a man's voice rose above the noise of the gate area, calling out that there were only 2 seats left on his coach and offering them at a last-minute reduced price. The word sale caught Gale's attention immediately, and his eyes lit up. He asked where the coach was headed. The man told him it was going to Farmage, the agricultural hub, for just 1 silver coin. Gail turned the destination over in his mind. An agricultural hub meant fresh produce and good food, and that thought alone was enough to make him practically drool. He raised his hand and said he was getting on. At the same moment, another hand went up from nearby. A woman's voice said she would take the remaining seat. Gail turned to look at her, feeling a vague sense of recognition. The woman pulled back her cloak and addressed him by name, pointing out that it had only been a few days. Gail placed her. She was Moria Glaris, the support mage from Cush's party. The recognition hit him, and he started to say something about how she would be easy to spot given how striking she was, beginning a thought about a particular quality of hers before thinking better of it. Moria turned toward him with a smile that carried a very clear warning. Gail immediately tried to backtrack and internally apologized to himself, acknowledging it as an instinctive male reaction he had not managed to keep in check. The two of them climbed into the carriage and settled in amid the noise and movement of departure. Gail suggested they at least get along for the duration of the trip. His cheek was already stinging. Moria had punched him in the face shortly before boarding. She responded with exaggerated pleasantness that the pleasure was entirely hers. As the town fell behind them, Gail let out a yawn. He was tired, and the rocking of the carriage was not helping him stay awake. Moria nudged him and told him he was sitting too close. He apologized and noted there was not much room to work with. He looked around at his fellow passengers, metal goods and imports being transported for sale, a mercenary keeping watch over the cargo, a handful of other travelers filling the remaining seats, and beside him, this woman of unusually strong who had already left the party he had once been thrown out of. It had happened fast. He tried to work out how he was supposed to sleep under these conditions. He tried again to smooth things over, suggesting they simply keep things calm and easy between them for the journey. Moria told him she was not actually angry. He thought about that and decided she probably meant it. What had happened between him and the party had nothing to do with her. He suspected Cush had recruited her for his own reasons, and the way they had handled everything suggested they had probably been looking for an excuse to push Gail out for some time before it finally happened. He let that thought settle and then asked Moria why she had left the Wolfpack. The woman looked at Gail and told him she genuinely wanted to know how he had managed to stay with that terrible party for as long as he had without walking away. She then laughed and filled him in on what had happened from her end. Gail was taken aback, unable to believe that Cush had been unable to handle something as straightforward as an ogre. Moria confirmed it without hesitation, describing Cush as the most worthless leader she had ever encountered, and the other three as little more than amateurs armed with weak spells and bows. She wanted to know what could have possibly led Gail to join a group like that in the first place. Gail asked her to confirm that it had really been Cush she was talking about. She said there was no one else it could have been, and added that the guild now had its eye on him, which was why he was leaving the capital and waiting for things to settle down. She told him that as far as she could see, those people had been blaming him for everything going wrong. But from where she had been standing, he was the only one among them who had actually been worth anything. Gail smiled at that. Moria caught herself and quickly apologized, suddenly remembering that he had known those people. Gail told her it was fine and apologized on their behalf for all the trouble they had put her through. She told him it was not his fault. She addressed him formally by his last name, Hamilton, and Gail told her to just call him Gail. A comfortable silence settled between them after that. Gail looked at her and noticed she did not seem to have much with her. He got the impression she had jumped onto the transport immediately after leaving the party. Without making a big deal of it, he reached into his things, pulled out a bun, chopped up some ingredients, and put together a kind of simple sandwich which he offered to her. He told her she was welcome in what he called the Wolfpack Victims Club. She was not entirely sure the label applied to him, but her eyes landed on the sandwich and softened. She accepted it with quiet thanks. He told her not to worry about it, and then looked around at the other passengers on the carriage and offered food to them as well. Moria bit into the sandwich and said with genuine appreciation that it was good and that he had put it together remarkably fast. Gail laughed it off, giving credit to the ingredients. He also produced some wine. She accused him playfully of trying to get her drunk, but then she got a proper look at the bottle and her expression changed entirely. She recognized it as Romaine wine and pointed out that it was worth a considerable amount of money, asking whether he was really sure she could have some. He told her his stall had done well and to go ahead. She opened the bottle. As she did, she brought up something she had heard about. Apparently, there had been a significant stir at the marketplace recently, with rumors spreading that artifact-class items had been found at one of the ordinary market stalls. She relayed this, without any awareness that the person she was telling was the very one responsible for it. Gail reacted with exaggerated surprise, remarking that selling something of that caliber from a roadside stall would be a remarkably foolish thing to do. Moria agreed, and added that the princess was apparently looking into it as well. Gail sat with that piece of information quietly. The stall, the princess, the castle. A specific memory began surfacing in his mind, but he pushed it aside and shook his head. There was no way. Moria asked him, as if catching something in his expression, whether that could possibly have been him. He asked her back whether he looked like the kind of person who dealt in artifacts. She said honestly that she could not say he did. He told her she could have at least stretched the truth, and said yes. She laughed and pointed out that people who could craft artifacts lived in holy sanctuaries and places like that. Gail agreed, adding that they were like hermits up on mountain peaks. Then, for emphasis, he contorted his face into an exaggerated, wrinkled expression. When Moria turned and saw it, she burst out laughing so hard that the sound filled the entire carriage. The two of them exchanged a high five, and Moria told him that she was starting to like him. Gail said he did not exactly dislike her either. He mused that if either of them had been frontline fighters, they might have made a decent team. A curse crafter and a support mage was not quite the right combination, but if the opportunity ever came up, he did not get to finish the thought. Something struck the carriage hard. Everything went dark for a moment. Voices outside erupted in alarm. Orcs were attacking the caravan. The impact had thrown Gail off balance, and he found himself leaning directly into Moria. He made an absent remark about the softness of the situation he had landed in. Moria hit him and told him firmly that now was not the time for that. She pointed out that the caravan was under attack. Gail acknowledged that he was well aware and noted from the sounds coming from outside that things were not going well for the people out there. A man came running back to the carriage in a panic, calling for help. The orcs had overwhelmed the mercenary guards. The passengers inside were frightened, huddled together. The orcs turned their attention toward the wagon and began moving in that direction. Moria assessed the situation quickly and did not like what she saw. The orcs had spotted them. She was no stranger to combat, but neither she nor Gail were fighters by role. They were support and crafting types, and there was no one else in the carriage capable of fighting. She looked at the passengers and then asked Gail whether he had any kind of weapon on him. Gail was caught off guard by the question. Moria explained that there was simply no other choice. She had her staff and a small dagger, and she needed to know what he was working with. Gail told her he had a short sword and a handful of single-use debuff talismans. It was not encouraging, but Moria said they would make do and that they were going. Gail protested that the two of them were backline types and had no business charging into something like this. Moria acknowledged how absurd the situation was, but said flatly that she refused to sit inside and wait to be killed. Fighting was better, even under these circumstances, and she reminded him that while support magic was her specialty, she had handled emergencies before and was capable. He could trust her on that. Gail made his decision. He told Moria he would take the front and that she needed to back him up. She agreed immediately and offered a quick apology. He told her there was nothing to apologize for, adding that he would think poorly of himself if he let a woman fight alone out there. He rallied both of them with the thought of showing the orcs what two former S-rank party members were capable of, even if they had come from the worst S-rank party imaginable. He sized up the orcs ahead of them. They likely did not see the two of them as any real threat yet, which meant the element of surprise was the only real advantage they had. He would need to close the distance fast and take at least one of them down before that changed. Behind him, Moria was already moving. She scattered a handful of pebbles across the ground, swung her staff in a controlled arc, and a defensive barrier rose around them. She told Gail the wall would hold against a certain amount of punishment and told him to go. She would get a buff on him as quickly as she could. Gail moved forward, dagger in hand. Moria watched him go and then stopped, her eyes going to the dagger. Something was wrong with it, or rather, something was very deliberate about it. Dark energy was coiling around Gail and the blade as he moved, swirling in a way that made it look like something far more than an ordinary short sword. At the start of Chapter 7, Moria was laying out their plan quickly and clearly. Buff magic took time to reach its full effect, so she would need to time it carefully. Once the buff was fully active, she was confident Gail would be able to deal real damage to at least one orc. After that, he would need to use his curse abilities to pin them down while he took out as many as he could. Gail agreed with the plan, adding that if they held out long enough, a patrol would likely notice the commotion before too long. Beyond that, they were going to have to rely on whatever luck came their way. Moria then asked him again, with visible unease, about the strange and unsettling thing surrounding that dagger of his. Gail told her it was simply a debuffing dagger and nothing out of the ordinary. Moria could not believe he was calling it normal. He walked forward without further explanation and told her to just back him up. She called after him, but he was already moving. She knelt down and traced something on the ground with her fingers, muttering that the effect would not last long, but would be well worth it. She cast her elevation buff over the area. Gail reacted with surprise at the sudden rush of it, then hurled a cross-shaped object toward the cluster of orcs with impressive range and accuracy. It landed exactly where he intended. A scroll unfurled from it on impact. He charged straight at the orcs. The orcs turned their attention to him, but Gail's curses were already spreading across them. Moria watched from behind and felt her knees go weak at what she was witnessing. The orcs were grunting and stumbling, completely disoriented and confused by whatever was working its way through them. She could not make sense of what she was seeing. What kind of curse was coming off that debuff item? It appeared to be targeting only the monsters that were hostile to them, but she had the distinct feeling that if she let her guard down, even for a moment, it might pull her in too. The energy surrounding it was unlike anything she had encountered before. Gail broke into a full sprint toward the nearest orc, moving faster than Moria expected. She started to call out to him, realizing with alarm that her buff had not fully activated yet. But it did not seem to matter. The orc roared and Gail closed the distance in an instant. Before Moria could process what had happened, he had slashed clean through the orc's neck. He spun and dashed toward the others, cutting them down in quick succession, laughing and telling Moria that her buff was absolutely incredible. Moria stood there stunned. She had barely contributed anything yet. The buff was nowhere near fully active when he had done all of that. She looked at the scene and began piecing it together. The debuff curse, spreading through the area, was doing far more than simply reducing enemy effectiveness. At minimum, it was inflicting terror and anti-armor effects on the orcs, and most likely paralysis on top of that. She had never in her experience come across a disposable cursed item capable of producing all of those effects simultaneously. And then there was the dagger itself. Even from this distance, she could tell it had at least two distinct permanent effects active on it at all times. 0 armor penetration, and something she recognized as a sheep's clothing effect. He had called something like that normal. She pressed her hand to her head. The whole situation was beyond anything she knew how to categorize. Gail, for his part, was genuinely delighted. He could feel Moria's buff enhancing everything about him and called out to her with real gratitude, marveling at the effect. Moria tried to respond accurately. Technically, yes, she had contributed, but also in a meaningful sense, no, she had not done nearly what he was crediting her with. He declared that with the two of them working together, they were practically unstoppable. Moria asked why he was getting so worked up about it. Then she looked at his stats, and her face fell. They were dropping rapidly. She had forgotten to load the buff with sufficient magical force, and it was fading. She apologized quickly and assured him it was nothing to worry about while she worked to correct it. Gail leaped into the air and brought down another orc, announcing there was only one left. He landed and faced the final orc, but when it roared, more appeared behind it. He responded by throwing additional cursed items at the new arrivals. A massive explosion followed, and every one of the orcs was severed cleanly from the neck. He announced the victory and credited it entirely to Moria's buffs, adding that the slow curse he had used had brought their movement to a near standstill. Moria pulled a face. Slow magic did not typically reduce movement speed by 90%. Not even close. She tried to point this out, but before she could get through the explanation, she looked up and found Gail slipping around behind one of the remaining orcs and driving his dagger into the back of its neck. Another tremendous explosion went off. The orc dropped. Moria stared at it. She asked herself whether that had been an instant kill effect. Effects like that were extraordinarily rare and not something that could be handcrafted under normal circumstances. Nothing about this was making sense to her anymore. Gail turned to face her, grinning and announcing that they had won. Moria was mildly exasperated. She started to say something about the fact that if he was capable of all of that, there was a point to be made, but before she could finish, Gail had grabbed her hands and was trying to get her to spin around with him in celebration, going on about how extraordinary her support magic was. Moria went along with it half-heartedly and thanked him. Gail waved cheerfully at the passengers who had been peeking out at the whole spectacle, and they all came rushing out toward him in relief and excitement. Later that night, sitting by the campfire, Gail admitted that he had never really fought monsters before and that he had been genuinely terrified. Moria found this hard to believe, given that he had been part of Kush's party for some time. He confirmed he had been a founding member of the group, but pointed out that his role had always been that of a curse crafter. Combat was not what he was there for. Moria was quiet for a moment after hearing that. Then she said plainly that Kush had been a fool to let someone like him go. Gail smiled and stumbled over his words a little, touched by the remark, but also noting that he could understand why they had made the decision they had, without wanting to feel too sorry for himself. Moria demanded to know if he had any self-respect at all. Then she told him that the dandelion coffee he had made was remarkably good, and that he seemed to have a great many hidden abilities. She rephrased that. She would not call them tricks, she decided. A better word was omnipotence. Gail made a soft sound of protest and told her not to go that far, insisting he was not particularly useful in a fight. Moria decided the conversation was going in circles. He was something else entirely, she concluded to herself. She announced she was going to bed, thanked him for the coffee, and headed back to her tent. The other men remained around the fire. Gail sat with the word she had used turning over in his mind. Omnipotence. He had never thought of himself that way. Even today, he knew that what they had accomplished had only been possible because of Moria's support. But sitting there thinking back on it, he remembered what it felt like when he was still with his old guild party. Fighting monsters had actually been enjoyable in its own strange way. He laughed quietly to himself. Moria was genuinely good to him. The next morning the caravan pressed on, and before long the driver called out that their destination was nearly in sight. Moria nudged Gail awake where he had been dozing. He stirred and asked if they had arrived. She confirmed it. The two of them climbed out and walked toward Farmage together, taking in the sight of the place they had come all this way to reach. At the start of Chapter 8, Gail and Moria had arrived at a place called Farmage. It was a typical rural area filled with farmland, grazing animals, and agricultural establishments of various kinds. Gail noted that they were about an hour from the border and wondered aloud why they had gotten off the wagon there. Moria observed that it was clearly a farming hub, with nothing but fields, pastures, and more fields stretching out in every direction. She asked what his plan was from there. Gail said he intended to head to the local adventurers guild, trade in the orc parts he had collected for money, and then start taking on quests. Moria said she would follow him to the guild since she wanted to find a party to join, and she asked whether he was looking for a party as well. Gail said no, explaining that he wanted to work alone for a while. Later inside the Farmage Adventurers Guild, Gail was looking over the available quests when Moria reacted with disbelief at what he had selected. She could not believe he was seriously considering that particular quest on his own. Gail said he would be perfectly fine. He then turned to Moria and casually suggested she could help him out since all the quest involved was hunting down some undead, and it was ranked at a difficulty. Moria flatly refused. She pointed out that both of them were rearguard fighters and asked how he thought it would work out differently from the situation with the orcs. Gail simply smiled, which she interpreted as him thinking she was agreeing to come along. He told her she would see, and said this kind of thing was actually more his area of expertise than people might expect. Then a dark elf appeared and greeted them, asking whether they were looking to take on a quest. Gail greeted her back warmly, while Moria found herself wondering when on earth the elf had appeared, since she had not noticed her at all until she spoke. The dark elf looked Gail over and said she had not seen him before, asking if he was new to the area. Gail confirmed it and said he had come fresh from the capital and thought he would try his luck in a different region. The elf said that was wonderful news for them, explaining that Farmage was primarily a farming and trading town with very few adventurers to speak of, which made things genuinely difficult for the guild. She took hold of his hands as she said this, and Gail noticed privately that she was quite attractive. Moria, standing behind him, let out a deliberate cough. The elf noticed and asked whether Moria was a friend of his. Moria said they were not friends and that she had simply been traveling in the same direction. She introduced herself and mentioned that she was also from the capital and was a support mage who was hoping to offer her services and would be very happy to do so. The dark elf's eyes lit up, and she said a support mage was exactly the kind of person they were in great demand of. She then turned her attention back to Gail and looked him over, noting that he appeared lightly equipped and asking whether he was perhaps a thief. Gail said no, that he was a support type as well, specifically a curse crafter. The dark elf's expression shifted slightly at hearing this. Gail said he had seen that kind of reaction coming and clarified that while support was his primary role, he was also capable of fighting. The elf quickly apologized and said she had meant no offense, explaining that curse crafters were simply an uncommon sight in their area, and she was not certain there would be work well suited to his specific abilities. Gail flushed a little. Moria was quietly irritated by the exchange. Gail said he was thinking of starting with a quest or two to familiarize himself with the area and get a feel for things. The dark elf pointed out with some concern that he had picked the Lich Hunt quest of all things, and explained that the quest had been sitting unresolved for quite a long time. She said the reason it had gone untouched was that the area lacked cleric-type adventurers, and especially none who were strong enough to venture into the crypt where the problem was centered. No one had shown any interest in taking the job, which meant that local families were unable to visit the graves of their loved ones while the undead ran rampant without any check on them. It was a deeply frustrating cycle with no end in sight. She asked Gail directly whether he thought he could actually handle something like this, because if he was purely a curse crafter, she was genuinely worried he would not come back. Moria pointed out that the elf could stand to phrase her concerns a little more diplomatically. Gail said he was used to it. Moria started to say more, but Gail cut her off gently and said it would be fine. The elf said she had warned them, and added that as she had mentioned, nobody in town had managed to complete this quest yet. If he got into serious trouble, he should not expect anyone to come in after him. Gail accepted all of this and said he would go in the following day, then asked whether there was a map available. The elf produced one and offered to sell him holy water and magic supplies as well. Gail said he only needed the map. The elf confirmed the quest was his and began explaining what he would need to bring back as proof of completion. Gail cut in and finished the sentence for her, saying he knew it was Lich Jawbones, and that he was familiar with them because he had made considerable use of them before. The elf found it an odd thing for an adventurer to say, but moved on, leaning slightly toward him as she expressed genuine hope that he would take care of himself, reminding him that their region was facing a real shortage of adventurers. Gail was blushing noticeably when something came down hard on his foot. Moria had stepped firmly on his toes. The elf smiled and remarked that the two of them clearly had a comfortable rapport with each other. She then added that she had almost forgotten to formally welcome them to Farmage. She introduced herself as Gimli, the guild master of the agricultural hub, bowed politely, and said it was a pleasure to be doing business with them. Gail responded warmly. Then, as though it had just occurred to him, he mentioned that he also had some goods to trade in and pulled out a sack. Gimli looked at the contents with visible amazement. Gail said they would tackle the quest the following day and left it at that. Gimli commented that he was remarkably casual about the whole thing, as though moving between towns and throwing himself at dangerous quests was something he did without a second thought. He thanked her, and she told him it had not been a compliment. Once outside, Moria immediately asked why he had been staring at the elf simply because she had given him a little attention. Gail smiled and asked what she meant. Moria told him to forget it. She then said that perhaps she would just go along with him on all of this after all. Gail pointed out that she had been planning to do that all along anyway. Moria said nothing. Gail noted that her silence meant she was not denying it. Moria insisted loudly that she was not worried about him personally in any way, and that the only reason she was tagging along was to be there when he inevitably needed saving, nothing more than that. Gail looked at her with wide eyes. She flushed and demanded to know why he was looking at her like that. He said simply that having her around genuinely reassured him. She went even redder and asked how he could possibly say something like that with such a straight face. Gail admitted that this was his first solo quest and that he was actually quite nervous about it. Moria said that anyone going on an undead hunt should be a great deal more nervous than he appeared to be, and asked why he seemed almost eager for it. Gail explained that, to him, undead creatures were essentially walking bags of crafting ingredients, and he could barely wait to get started. Moria was left without a response. Meanwhile, as the night settled over the town, the elf called Gimli sat quietly with her thoughts, turning over what she had just encountered. She found herself thinking about Gail and what it meant that a cursed crafter had shown up in Farmage. Gimli sat quietly with her thoughts, becoming increasingly certain that the man she had just met was no ordinary cursed crafter. The following morning, Gail woke up feeling thoroughly rested and said so with some enthusiasm. Moria pointed out that they had actually overslept and that it was already past noon. Gail noticed as they made their way through town that the locals were staring at them with open curiosity. He had felt the same thing when they had first arrived. Just as Gimli had said, Farmage was a place built around farming and trade, where armed adventurers were a rare and unusual sight. The two of them were clearly a novelty to the people there, though Gail decided there was no reason to let it bother him. Before long, they arrived at the entrance to the crypt. Gail expressed his intent to finish the quest quickly and get it over with cheerfully. Moria went through her supplies methodically, checking that she had her silver knife, anti-incense, and holy water. Gail called her a worrywart. She said she was simply being prepared. Gail assured her that everything would be fine and mentioned that he was actually something of a specialist when it came to the undead. Moria said his casual attitude only made her more anxious, not less. She made him promise that if things went badly, they would both run. Gail agreed easily, saying that was completely fine with him and that he understood being at the rear was hard on her. Moria corrected him firmly and said she meant they would both run together. Then Gail spotted a door. Beyond it opened up an enormous graveyard. Gail said something appreciative about the view. Moria scolded him and reminded him they were not there as tourists. The state of the cemetery was clearly the work of the undead who had been running rampant through it. Gail began moving through the space and tossing skeletal remains aside. Moria asked what he was doing, and he pointed out that they had left footprints he wanted to follow. She noted that the cemetery had apparently been built over what had once been a dungeon long ago, and judging by its size, it was very old. She asked quietly whether they would be in trouble for disturbing the graves. Gail said practically that there was no other way to explore deeper into the area. Moria said she was trying to show some respect for the dead and pressed her hands together in a brief gesture of reverence. Gail remarked that she was quite devout. Moria said that compared to him, just about anyone would be. Gail then pointed out that the skull she had just been paying her respects to was not simply a dead person, but an actual undead creature. Since the sun was out, it was dormant for now, but it would animate again once night fell. To illustrate the point, he held the skull up close to her face for her to look at. She stared at it for a moment, and then smashed it without hesitation and turned her back on the whole thing. Gail asked what had happened to respecting the dead. Moria said that did not apply to the undead, who were simply monsters, and that she hated this entire situation. Gail thought to himself that she could have simply waited outside. He told her it was all right and explained that the cemetery had not been converted into dungeon territory very long ago, which meant the upper levels would have weaker monsters. Moria said that was not remotely reassuring. Gail told her he was going to head deeper down where the better quality crafting materials were, and suggested she simply go back since there was no point in her wasting her holy water down here. He handed her a lantern, waved goodbye, casually, and walked away muttering to himself about all the materials waiting for him. Moria was left standing alone. She thought to herself that Wolfpack members were all the same, completely self-centered people who just walked off and left others behind. She glanced around and noticed how dark everything was. Something made a sound nearby, and she forced herself to hold her ground for a moment before deciding she was not going to stay there alone and went after him. They were now deeper in the cemetery together. Moria kept saying she wanted to get out of there. Then something brushed past her in the dark, and she let out a shriek. Gail shivered from the sound. She insisted something had touched her, and it had been real. Her eyes filled with tears as she grabbed hold of him. He flushed a little. Then an explosion of some kind went off somewhere nearby, and she screamed and pressed herself against him even harder. He told her to calm down while he looked around for the source of the noise. He noticed, among other things, that she was pressed quite firmly against him, and it struck him for a brief moment before he forced his attention back to the situation at hand. He found the source of the sound. It was only a bat. Moria shoved him away and insisted she had known that perfectly well and that she had just been getting back at him for something from before and that the undead were just a bunch of bones anyway. But when she spun around behind her to prove her point, she came face to face with a skeleton standing directly in front of her. She leaped back at Gail with a scream, clinging to him and shouting that the skeletons were right there. He complained about his ear. She struggled in his arms in a complete panic, and he asked her to at least try to calm down a little. She insisted, through her tears, that she could not calm down, that it was simply not possible. He told her that even if she could not calm down, she could at least stop screaming directly into his ear. When she finally opened her eyes again, another skeleton was gaping at her from close range. Moria reached her absolute limit. She swung her arms wildly and smashed the skeleton apart while shouting at it to stay away from her. Gail stared in shock. Moria grabbed the lantern, still panting, and hurled it at the remaining skeletons. They were hit and caught fire. As another skeleton came toward her, she screamed and shoved Gail directly into it, sending him stumbling into the burning undead. Later, once things had settled, Gail asked if she was feeling any calmer. Moria apologized. He asked her why she had come at all if she was this terrified of undead. She looked away and said quietly that hunts like this were too dangerous for someone to tackle alone, and that she had been worried about him. Gail told her again that he kept saying he was fine and that his skills as a curse crafter were particularly well suited to dealing with undead. He thanked her sincerely for looking out for him and offered her his hand to help her stand. He pointed out that they were quite deep in now and it would be too dangerous for her to try to make her way back up alone. He asked if she could hold on a little longer. She said she could. He told her that if she got frightened, she could just close her eyes. She said she would get completely lost if she did that. He said that was fine and that she could hold his hand and they would take it slowly. Both of them went red in the face. As they walked along hand in hand, Gail thought to himself with some surprise that he had actually only been joking when he suggested it. In Chapter 9, just before Gail and Moria had left the capital, the Wolfpack party had tried to visit a blacksmith's forge to sell some of their gear. The smith took one look at them and told them he did not do business with people like them, and they were turned away. They ended up back in an alley, bickering among themselves in frustration. They were hungry, cold, and desperately in need of money. Another night on the streets was looking increasingly likely. Luke announced he had picked up some available quests from the guild and laid out the options. There was an A-rank quest to hunt down A-rank ogres on the highways, a C-rank quest to wipe out a horde of skeleton knights at an old church grounds outside the capital, an E-rank quest to deal with a goblin soldier troop that was causing damage, and a D-rank quest to defeat orcs that had been spotted out in the wilderness. The others stared at him with a mixture of disbelief and outrage, insisting that as an S-rank party, they should not be lowering themselves to jobs of that caliber and demanding to know if he was mocking them. Norris tried to bring everyone back down to earth and reminded them that they were all running on empty and simply could not take on anything seriously difficult in their current weakened state. He reasoned that they needed to regroup and work back up from where they were, drawing on the saying that even a lion uses its full strength to hunt a hare. Cush acknowledged this reluctantly, but made no effort to hide his contempt for the available options. He looked over the rewards and noticed that the highest-paying job was the ogre hunt at 60 gold coins, but when the memory of their recent encounter with an ogre surfaced in their minds, they all quietly chose to pass on it. They told themselves it was not out of fear, but simply not worth the bother. There were no S-rank quests available anywhere on the board. Melissa pushed for the C-rank skeleton quest, since the D and E-rank rewards were too small to be worth their time. Norris was not keen on the idea of facing an entire horde, and suggested the orcs instead. Cush dismissed the concern about skeletons, and said a C-rank job was nothing to worry about. Melissa said bags of bones would be straightforward for them. Luke noted that undead were generally weak opponents, though he quietly wondered to himself whether their magic would hold up under the circumstances. He glanced at Melissa and Cush and figured that if the two frontliners were eager and ready, things would be manageable. He and Norris exchanged a quiet understanding between themselves that at worst the two frontliners would get hurt before anyone else needed to step in, and that looking after their own well-being came first. Later that day, the party arrived at the old church grounds outside the capital. Luke climbed up to get a view over the walls and reported back that there were approximately 20 skeletons gathered inside, concealed in the shadows beyond the gate. Cush laughed off the number and said 20 was nothing. Melissa agreed it was practically already done. They laid out their plan. Cush raised his sword toward the sky and activated his holy light skill, directing it at the skeletons and declaring loudly that this was their end. The flash of light activated and the skeletons stirred and began rising to their feet. Melissa launched herself forward and started cutting them down with rapid strikes. She signaled Norris, who followed up with his magic, and she used the momentum to fly over the heads of the undead and crash down into them. Cush would use his paladin skill called Holy Light to act against the undead. Melissa would attack while moving. Norris would use fire magic to burn any groups that cluster together, and Luke would deliver finishing blows. Luke and Norris would hold back and only engage when their help was genuinely needed. Everyone agreed, and they moved into position. For a brief moment the plan seemed to be working, and they allowed themselves to feel confident. But before Cush could finish celebrating what he thought was an easy victory, a bone struck him hard across the face. The same happened to Melissa in the same instant. Both of them were sent flying through the air and crashed to the ground, while Norris and Luke stood back and watched in stunned silence. More undead closed in around the fallen pair and continued to beat them. Luke called out to Norris with rising urgency and said they were in serious trouble. Norris said he would hit the undead with fire and chanted the words for what was meant to be an inferno-level attack. What came out was a tiny flame. Everyone stared at it in disbelief. Luke questioned what such a small spark was supposed to accomplish. Norris insisted it was actually a highly concentrated ball of heat and directed it at the undead, arguing it should still carry significant force. It barely affected the undead at all, and now those same undead had noticed Norris and Luke. Both of them turned and ran, slamming the gate shut behind them as they fled. The C-rank quest to wipe out the Skeleton Knight horde at the old church grounds had been failed completely. The following day, they set their sights on the orc quest instead. Melissa launched herself at the approaching orc and landed on it, declaring her intent to bring it down. The orc fell under the impact. The others asked whether she had finished it off. Melissa was surprised to find that her blade had gotten stuck in the orc's body, and she could not pull it free. Before anyone could do anything, the orc grabbed her hand and swung her high into the air. Melissa found herself face to face with the creature and wondered in alarm whether it was trying to carry her off. She struggled desperately and called out to Kush for help, her clothing in a state of considerable disorder from the ordeal. The orc stared at her for a moment, then simply let her go and turned away. Norris and Luke burst out laughing, pointing out that she was apparently not the orc's type. Melissa yelled that it was not funny. Kush spotted his chance and dashed toward the orc, noting that its back was completely exposed. He slashed at it with full force, only for his sword to bounce clean off. The orc felt the blow, turned around slowly, and looked at Kush with undisguised fury. Kush managed a brief and rather helpless apology before the orc swung at both of them and sent them flying. The D-rank orc quest had been failed. A few days later, the party sat at the capital's guild, looking thoroughly defeated and miserable. As had become their habit, they laid all the blame for their continued failures squarely on Gail. Kush had even been forced to sell his favorite gear to make ends meet. The people around them in the guild were muttering among themselves about what a sorry sight the once mighty Wolfpack had become. Norris declared that once they had scraped together enough money, they would track Gail down and make him answer for it. Luke speculated that, knowing Gail, he might actually have followed through and opened some kind of stall. Kush agreed with the idea as a possibility, then turned the group's attention to the current options and asked whether the Goblin Quest was their next target. Melissa said it had to be manageable. They took it on, but when they returned afterward, they were in an even worse state than before, more beaten and worn out than at any point previously. The guild receptionist asked flatly whether they had failed again. The party told her in no uncertain terms to be quiet. Kush muttered furiously that the whole thing had been completely unfair. Looking back on how the Goblin Quest had unfolded, the village people had been genuinely amazed and grateful to see an S-rank party stepping in to handle their problem. Kush had assured everyone grandly that with the Wolfpack on the job, they were as good as saved, and told the villagers they could leave everything to them. One of the villagers had offered to help in whatever way they could, but Kush had confidently waved this off and said they would handle the front line themselves, and the villager would not need to lift a finger. Then the goblins had arrived mounted on horses, and the Wolfpack had once again been beaten so thoroughly that they could barely move. Back at the guild, Kush reported that the village had refused to pay them, calling them useless and lazy. The receptionist said calmly that she thought they would be much better off stepping down from their S-rank. Kush grabbed her by the collar and demanded she give him easier work. She seized his hand in return and struck him hard across the face. The other three members of the party stood there looking at Kush lying on the floor, having absolutely no idea what to do. Meanwhile, deep in the cemetery, Gail was looking down into another level of the crypt where more undead were gathered below. He noted to himself that the deeper he went, the more densely packed the wandering souls became. The sheer amount of usable material available in this place was remarkable, and he was pleased at the prospects. Moria tugged at his sleeve beside him. She asked whether something was out there. Gail said there was nothing. She pointed out that she could clearly hear the clicking sounds of undead nearby, and told him he was lying. She pressed herself against him and closed her eyes tightly as they continued walking forward. He told her to stop clinging to him like that. She insisted that she could feel something and that she was not imagining it. Then, as if to confirm her instincts, something actually did emerge. A skeletal arm pushed up through the soil of a grave, and a normal-sized skeleton hauled itself upright. Behind it, an enormous skeleton heaved itself out of its own grave. Moria said she had known something was there. She asked whether she could open her eyes, saying keeping them closed was unbearable. Gail thought privately that opening them would actually be considerably scarier for her. He told her it was fine and that there was nothing to worry about, and said to wait just 3 more seconds. He raised his hand and chanted a spell. The skeletons dissolved and crumbled away. When Moria opened her eyes, the undead had already been reduced to nothing. She asked with disbelief whether he had just defeated an undead creature using a dispel. Gail confirmed it, and said she had seen how straightforward it was. Moria could not believe he was calling it easy and demanded to know whether he had any idea what he was actually doing. She said she had never once heard of a dispel being effective against undead in that way. Gail said it was similar in principle to what priests did. Moria asked whether he meant the practice of banishing evil, which was a form of holy magic that priests used to purify people and places. Gail said yes, that was exactly it, though he added that using holy magic was actually not something he particularly recommended. Moria asked why. Gail took a moment to think about how best to explain it. He said first of all, to make sure they were on the same page, what he was doing was not quite the same as banishing the dead. It was closer to listening to their stories. In Chapter 10, Gail was holding a skull, while Moria stood beside him looking uncertain about what he had just said. She could not understand what he meant by listening to the undead, and asked how that was any different from what priests did. Gail told her to slow down, and said he would explain everything properly. He asked her what she thought caused the undead to rise and move around. She guessed it might be magic or malice of some kind. Gail said she was on the right track, but at that moment, an undead rose up directly behind her, and she screamed. Gail spun around quickly and dealt with it. He explained that this kind of thing was mostly what drove the undead, and that she would see that pattern repeated throughout a place like this crypt. He pointed out that the undead did not enjoy being purified or banished, and chanted a dispel to demonstrate. Moria agreed that of course they would not enjoy it. Gail continued and asked her to think about it from their perspective. These were beings that had manifested in the world driven by some unresolved grudge, and then along comes someone who shouts at them to be gone in the name of some higher power, giving them no chance whatsoever to respond or be heard. He asked her whether as a child she had ever felt angry at being scolded by her parents without being given a chance to explain her side of things. The question triggered a memory in Moria. She remembered her father declaring flatly that adventuring was something she could never do. She had pushed back and pointed out that plenty of girls became adventurers. Her father had slammed his fist down and told her to stop talking nonsense. Gail called her gently back to the present. She apologized and said it was nothing. He continued his explanation, saying that if the undead carried any kind of resentment, the right approach was simply to hear them out. Those who died hungry would still carry that longing. Those who died alone would feel the isolation of it. Occasionally one would encounter stronger and more painful grudges, like those who were killed unjustly for something they had not done. But ultimately, these were feelings that all living people experienced at one point or another. Moria asked him to go on. He explained that by simply listening to them and taking their side, there was usually enough comfort offered that the soul could finally move on and pass through to where they belonged. He then walked over to a coffin and opened it to show her what he meant. An undead rose from within, and Moria, terrified, flung herself at Gail and screamed. What had emerged was a dark skeleton knight, a type of monster that was far beyond what rear-line fighters could handle at close range, more dangerous even than a lich in that kind of proximity. In her panic, Moria had buried Gail's face entirely in her, and he managed to tell her in a muffled voice that he could not breathe. He lifted her up slightly, so he could see over her, and then began walking toward the undead while still holding her. Moria realized what was happening and began crying and screaming that they should not be going any closer. The skeleton knight drew its sword and turned its gaze on them. Gail raised a finger toward it and calmly chanted a dispel. The magic gleamed, and the undead crumbled away. He set Moria down and told her it was over and to let go of him. When she looked at where the undead had been, she saw the image of a young man appearing above the spot where it had fallen. Gail smiled. The young man, dressed in a knight's attire, bowed his head toward Gail in quiet gratitude, and then faded away. Moria stared in disbelief at what she had just witnessed. Gail said cheerfully that yes, that kind of thing happened. Moria said that was not a satisfying answer at all, and that she had no idea what he had actually done. That creature had been a B-rank monster, and yet a young man had simply appeared above it and disappeared. Gail explained that the young man had apparently died before he was able to say goodbye to his fiancée, and that the unresolved grief of that moment was likely what had kept him bound to the world as an undead. Moria asked how he could possibly know something like that. Gail said he just did, and explained that through years of crafting curse gear, he had developed a sensitivity to the subtle signals the undead gave off. By listening to those signals and responding in a way that acknowledged what they needed, he could usually bring them the satisfaction necessary for them to finally pass on. Moria said slowly that they simply wanted to be heard and sympathized with, not lectured or advised. Gail confirmed it, saying they had all been human once after all. He added that this approach was also beneficial from a practical standpoint, because undead defeated this way yielded better quality materials than those purified by holy magic, since purification through priests removed all traces of cursed remnants from the remains. As they continued walking forward, Moria looked at him quietly. She asked whether he saw the undead as nothing more than easy targets. He said that for now, they were primarily a source of materials to him. She grabbed his hand in irritation and began scolding him intensely, calling out the undead they were passing and treating their existence as though they were just raw supplies waiting to be harvested. She grabbed his collar and shook him, demanding he apologize on behalf of every priest in the world right that moment. Gail was genuinely taken aback by the sudden intensity of her reaction. He asked why anyone would complain about him dispelling undead, since the outcome was good for everyone involved. Moria said it was not something anyone could be quite as casual about as he was being. She pressed her hands to her head as it throbbed from the realization of just how unusual the way Gail's mind worked truly was. Gail told her to stop shouting directly into his ears. He then asked if she wanted to hold his hand. She said yes. Together, they descended deeper down the stairs into the lower reaches of the crypt. Gail announced that they had arrived. It was the deepest part of the entire crypt. Both of them noticed immediately that this level was far more brightly lit than any of the floors above it. The reason became clear when they looked around and saw the sheer number of undead gathered there. Skeleton knights, ghoul shooters, dark phantoms, and wights were all present, and there appeared to be a portal of some kind that looked as though it might connect directly to the world beyond death. Moria estimated there were around 50 undead in total, and she thought to herself that assembling this many pale souls in one place would naturally produce enough spiritual light to illuminate a room to this degree. Gail asked whether she was all right keeping her eyes open at this point. Moria said she was fine and that she had gotten used to it. She pulled herself together and steadied herself, tensing her body as she prepared for whatever came next. Gail thought to himself that Moria was a terrible liar about being fine. He looked around the chamber carefully. Moria asked what he was doing. He turned and said he was trying to figure out why there were no liches present. Moria suggested that perhaps they should turn back then, since without a lich they would have to come back and try again another time. Neither of them noticed that her staff had been slowly slipping from where it rested. Then a loud clang rang out as it struck the floor. Every undead in the room spun around at once to face them. Moria felt a wave of cold dread wash over her, convinced it was all over. She was surprised when the undead did not attack them, but instead shivered and trembled where they stood. She pushed Gail behind a pillar to hide. Then another undead appeared through a door, this one carrying a horn, and unlike anything they had encountered in the crypt so far. There was no mistaking what it was. This was the ruler of the crypt, a sorcerer, classified as a disaster-level threat. Sorcerers were considered one of the most powerful and dangerous types of undead in existence. When even a single one emerged onto the surface, it was capable of building an army and spreading terror and death across entire regions. Moria could not understand what one was doing down here. Gail muttered quietly to himself that this was exactly what he had been hoping to find. Moria could barely believe what she was hearing. She pointed out that even dealing with a sorcerer would normally require a high priest, not a curse crafter. Gail whispered back, asking whether that was really true. Moria pressed on, adding that Gail did not even attend church services on his days off. Before the conversation could continue, there was a deafening boom. The pillar they had been hiding behind crumbled apart. Gail answered through the settling dust that she was right. He did not attend church, and that he spent his days off at home, crafting curse gear and making dispel talismans. Moria grabbed hold of him and pulled as another explosion went off. She ducked behind him. Another blast struck from behind. Looking toward the sorcerer, they could see power radiating outward from it and washing over the other undead in the room. The rest of the undead, now energized by their ruler, turned their collective gaze on Gail and Moria and began moving toward them. The two of them ran. Moria called out to him to stop running in circles and said they should simply leave. If even one hit from a sorcerer connected with them, it would be over. Gail asked her for just a little more time. She demanded to know what he meant. He reached for something, held it against the ground, and drove it in. The undead surrounding them erupted in flames. He then chanted what he called a dispel blessing. Moria was stunned into silence. What he had used was a high priest-level spell specifically designed to save those afflicted by curses, and he had been making items capable of producing it on the side without anyone knowing. The spell dispersed all the miasma that had been pouring out from the undead horde in a single sweeping effect. Then something extraordinary happened. For just a brief moment before they dissolved, each of the undead appeared to Moria in their original human forms. Then they melted away one by one, leaving behind a feeling in the air that Moria could only describe as one of quiet fulfillment and peace. Gail stretched his arms out afterward and commented that the air in the room felt considerably fresher. Moria sat down on the floor and covered her face with her hands, swearing to herself that she was never setting foot in a crypt again. She thought about what had just happened, taking down an entire undead army as though it were nothing, and treating the whole thing like a casual day out was simply not something that was supposed to be possible for a normal person. Gail told her she was exaggerating. He said mages encountered sorcerers fairly regularly, implying it was not such a rare occurrence. Moria shot back that usually the church had to organize and dispatch an entire platoon of temple knights just to deal with a single sorcerer, and that if they were as common as Gail was suggesting, the world would have collapsed long ago. Gail said he had come across them fairly often in large and ancient crypts like this one, and thought the sorcerer they had just encountered had probably been a noble who once ruled over the land above. Moria asked whether that meant Gail had been exploring crypts regularly for some time. He smiled brightly and hugged the bag of collected materials, saying enthusiastically that it was genuinely exciting work when he found a place this rich in materials and thought about everything he could craft for what he had gathered. Moria gave a flat and unenthusiastic response. She looked at him and said he really did love curse things with a great deal of genuine passion. He began wrapping something he was holding and said that making them was a great deal of fun. His necklace jingled as he moved. Moria noticed it, along with the sword the sorcerer had dropped and the staff beside it. Gail said the designs looked interesting to him. Moria said she could not agree with his aesthetic sensibilities. Gail reacted with genuine surprise and said that if she did not appreciate this kind of thing, she was missing out, and that he genuinely wished more people shared his taste. Moria asked about his stall, since he had mentioned running one earlier, and asked how that experience had gone. Gail lit up and told her about a young woman who had been a customer and had genuinely loved his designs, and said that many others had also complimented how original everything looked. He explained that curse gear could serve as home decor that actually provided real protection, which had created its own demand. Moria gave him a sour expression. Gail pointed out that she was the one who had asked. He said that people would eventually come around to appreciating what he made, that it was only a matter of time. Moria said flatly that they would not, and said she could guarantee it. Gail asked why she was so certain, and said she should wait and see, that he would prove it through his gear and his stall. Moria found her thoughts drifting back to a memory. She remembered the day at the guild, when she had been approached with an offer to join a party. She had heard people in the background berating someone named Gail and telling him to hurry up, calling him a burden. A woman's voice had said they might as well just leave him because he was too easygoing. The woman at the guild counter had explained to Moria that the group in question was the Wolfpack, an S-rank party whose members had rough attitudes but genuinely had the skill to back up their rank. Moria had glanced over at the man being shouted at, and then decided that if the money was good enough, she would take the offer. That had been the day Gail was fired. She thought about how different he had seemed then. After all the contempt and dismissal his supposed friends had heaped on him, he had been on edge and deflated, stumbling over his words when she first encountered him properly. But now that he was free of all of that, his eyes shone with a brightness that was almost overwhelming to look it up close. Everything he was hoping for from the future was visible in them. Moria felt a small smile come to her face. She said quietly that perhaps things were fine just as they were. Gail asked what she meant. She said that spending time with him had actually been kind of fun. He laughed and asked whether she was serious, given how close she had come to crying back there in the crypt. She fumed and insisted that had not counted as being close to crying. He apologized, but said he was genuinely grateful for it either way. He said that after being thrown out of his party, he had drifted to this farming town somewhat aimlessly, and that if he had been alone through all of it, it would have been a much lonelier experience. Even if the money was good or the town turned out to be a fine place to work, it would still just be him by himself. Having someone to laugh with made a real difference, and all of that was because of her. Moria looked at him and felt her face go completely red. She made a noise somewhere between exasperation and flustered embarrassment and moved away from him, saying he had no right to throw something so direct at her like that without any warning. Then, after composing herself, she said quietly and barely above a whisper that she was glad to be here too, and thanked him. Gail asked what she had said at the end. Moria thought to herself in disbelief about just how oblivious he truly was. At the start of Chapter 11, Moria asked Gail what he planned to do with the reward money from the quest. Gail said they would split it evenly between them. Moria argued against this, pointing out that she had not really done anything meaningful during the whole undertaking. She said she had decided to join him and then had done nothing but slow him down. Gail said that was not how it worked, and that a party was built around everyone playing their role. Moria pushed back and asked what role she had actually played, noting that all she had really done was carry some of his things. She then looked at the sheer volume of materials and equipment Gail was hauling and exclaimed that she could not understand how he was physically carrying all of it, since even a high-level porter would have struggled under that load. Gail lifted his hand to show her. He had a skull bracelet on his wrist. Moria said immediately that it was disgusting. Gail explained that it was a cursed bracelet that increased his carrying capacity, provided physical assistance, and helped with physical strain. He had made it himself specifically to help him transport his things. Moria was quietly shocked. She thought to herself that something capable of doing all of that could fundamentally change how wars were waged, and she pressed her hand to her face in disbelief. She asked him whether he had ever actually looked at the magic tools that were commercially available in stores. Gail said of course he had, and that any curse crafter needed to stay informed about current trends, but that they all looked unimpressive to him. Moria said she was not asking about appearances. She explained that, generally speaking, even the best magic items available commercially provided a single effect, because a person simply could not contain more than that within one item. The most powerful of those items might offer something like a 10% boost to a particular attribute. Anything that provided 2 or more effects and dramatically amplified abilities in the way Gail's work did would be considered a legendary item, or what people refer to as an artifact. Gail laughed and compared it to the kind of national treasures that existed in history, which he said looked especially unimpressive from a design standpoint. Moria said she was not talking about aesthetics. She thought to herself that what Gail produced was extraordinary by any measure, but that his thinking was just as peculiar as his work, and that he had no aesthetic sensibility and no conventional common sense whatsoever. She clenched her fist in frustration. Gail asked what the problem was with stacking multiple effects into one item, saying that with enough creative thinking a person could fit in whatever they wanted. His work was cursed, and that was simply how the mechanics of it functioned. Moria thought privately that if innovation alone were sufficient to produce results like his, people would not be spending such enormous sums of money on commercially made magic items. She turned to him and asked whether by his standards those magic items were essentially just toys. Gail responded that if that was what she thought, he could put together something like that for her very quickly and asked if she wanted one. Moria looked more annoyed and declined. She was turning the whole thing over in her mind, privately, thinking through the implications. The problem with curse gear was that once you put on you, could not remove it on your own. You needed someone with a specific skill to remove it for you, and the effects often came with a genuine price. An item might grant a massive offensive boost, but leave the user vulnerable to sunlight, creating complications for outdoor combat. Or it might cause confusion that made the wearer unable to tell friend from enemy. But what if there were a curse crafter who could control all of those variables precisely? Removing a curse from an item would also remove its beneficial effect. But what if someone crafted an item, deliberately left the curses in place, and then completely re-engineered the balance between what the item gave and what it took? What if that person could define exactly what the benefit was and keep the drawbacks minimal or non-existent? The thought made Moria shudder. She told Gail that he might be the kind of master craftsperson who genuinely changed the world. Gail responded that she was right, and said looking at his designs never got old for him. Moria gave a thin and sarcastic smile, and said that on reflection, never mind, he would never truly have his moment of recognition. Gail said it was quite something to be built up and knocked down in the same breath. Moria thought to herself that as long as Gail's sense of design remained what it was, the world would simply never catch on to just how remarkable his actual abilities were. Gail then announced he could see the town ahead and called out to Moria, waving down a passing cart for them to catch a ride on. He went over to speak with the cart owner. Moria watched him and thought to herself that Gail the Curse Crafter was quite a remarkable person and that she would not mind joining his party again properly. Later at the Adventurers Guild, Gimli delivered her usual welcome and then expressed surprise to see them back so quickly, asking whether they had given up on the quest. Gail said it was the opposite and placed the bags of collected materials in front of her, asking her to assess the goods so she could confirm everything was genuine. Gimli went through the contents and found dark skeletons, skeleton knights, and then stopped when she came across materials from sorcerer. She looked up at Gail and offered him a 10% price increase on the reward, then immediately revised it upward to 30%. Moria stepped in and explained that the quest had called for them to defeat liches, but that the crypt had grown extensive enough to be housing a sorcerer, which genuinely could have killed them. She looked directly at Gimli and pointed out that the guild had provided inaccurate information going in and asked whether 10% was really a fair offer under those circumstances. Gimli apologized and acknowledged that their guild was small and their intelligence sometimes fell short and offered 20% as a compromise. Moria accepted. Gail asked Moria why she had been so forceful about it. Moria told him he needed to stand firm on things like that, because proper preparation was essential before taking on any quest. She asked him to consider what would have happened if he had prepared to fight fire-type monsters based on the quest description only to arrive and find nothing but ice types. She asked if he understood why that mattered. Gail responded simply that Moria was really very kind to him. Moria said that was not what she was trying to be. Gimli cut back in and apologized again, saying she was still finding her footing with guild work. Gail told her it was perfectly fine and that most people simply did not venture deep enough into crypts to know what was actually down there. Gimli agreed, but said the fault was hers for taking the grave digger's account at face value. She slumped and looked genuinely downcast. Gail thought to himself that she looked quite endearing when she was like that. He told her it was not a big deal at all and that crypts were something of a specialty for him, adding that he would make a point of patrolling the area from time to time going forward. Gimli's expression immediately brightened, and she thanked him warmly before reaching over and hugging him. Gail thought to himself that for someone who did not necessarily look the part, Gimli was genuinely doing the job of a guildmaster. Moria stepped between them and told Gimli firmly to release him. Gail redirected things by asking Gimli whether she could begin the formal assessment. She said yes. Moria then turned to Gail and asked pointedly whether he had a thing for small girls like that. Gail denied what Moria was implying, clearly flustered by the accusation. Moria pointed out that he had been noticeably lenient with Gimli and had also been staring at her. Gail went red and continued to deny it. Moria said it was none of her business and turned away. Gail asked why she was being sulky about it. Moria insisted she was not sulky at all, and then informed him that Gimli was nowhere near the age he seemed to think she was. The woman was likely around 100 years old. At that moment, a sharp object struck the ground nearby. Gimli offered a breezy apology, claiming her hand had simply slipped. She then told them she would be giving them their quest reward along with her assessment of the work so far. Both Gail and Moria understood perfectly well that she had not accidentally dropped anything. She had been aiming at them. When Gimli placed the reward on the counter, Gail said he and Moria would divide it between them. Moria objected, saying it all belonged to Gail, but he insisted, leaving her no real choice but to accept. She thanked him. Gimli told them they could collect the remainder of the reward at a later time, wave them off, and watch them go. Once she was alone, Gimli turned things over in her mind. She shook her head with mild amusement at the thought of Moria so openly announcing a woman's age like that. Her quiet reflection was interrupted when someone called her name. Gimli recognized the visitor as someone she did not often see and asked what had brought them. The visitor said they had something to tell her. Gimli acknowledged this and noted that the guild was closed at night, letting the visitor know they were free to speak. The person stepped forward and delivered their news. The news stopped Gimli cold for a moment. An attempt had been made on Princess Kara's life, and the princess had survived it. The visitor confirmed this and explained that the princess had been protected by a piece of cursed equipment that had prevented an instant kill. Gimli asked whether it might have been an angel's shield, a holy church relic. The visitor said there was no information to suggest any such relic had been sent to the princess, which meant the item that had saved her was something unknown. Gimli found this deeply interesting. High-end cursed gear of that nature had always fascinated her. She asked who the assassins were. The visitor said their identity was unclear, but the methods used pointed toward military involvement. Gimli considered this and wondered quietly whether it might have been a strike from the Empire. She let out a soft laugh and remarked that it sounded like a very layered and complicated story was unfolding. The visitor said they would share more details as they became available. Gimli thanked them and tossed a coin their way as payment. The visitor acknowledged her with deference and then disappeared. Alone again, Gimli spoke quietly to herself. The Empire was not playing games, it seemed. Targeting Princess Kara, who stood among the closest heirs to the throne, pointed towards something like internal family conflict or deliberate power move. The pieces were multiplying: the capital, the Empire, and now this mysterious item of unknown origin. Her thoughts drifted to Gail. She had been watching him since the moment she first laid eyes on him. He had an alarming amount of cursed gear concealed beneath his cloak, far more than any ordinary person could endure without serious consequences. And yet he seemed entirely unaffected. Beyond that, he had managed to defeat a sorcerer with nothing more than a single support mage at his side. A curse crafter who treated curses as though they were ordinary tools, and who handled the undead as though they posed no real challenge. That was not someone she could dismiss easily. Later, as Gimli bathed and let her thoughts run freely, she continued, turning it all over. She was a dark elf, and like all of her kind, she carried a curse that could only be broken one way. The dark elves needed to obtain the devil's heart, a thing currently held by the Empire, and until they did, they would never be free of their curse or recover their lost power. Gimli had taken on the role of guild master as a side arrangement, using the position to gather information and quietly search for a way past the Empire's tight security. If there was now friction developing between the Empire and the capital, the resulting chaos might be exactly the opportunity her people had been waiting for. And then there was Gail, an exceptional curse crafter who had appeared almost out of nowhere at exactly this moment. She found herself wondering whether the mysterious cursed item that had saved the princess might actually turn out to be his work. A slow smile crossed her face. She rose and opened a door, looking at the items inside, and said to herself that Gail was a genuinely fascinating man. Meanwhile, far away in the capital, Gail's former party had made their way to a church, hoping a priest could undo what they believed were curses Gail had placed on them as revenge after being thrown out. The priest examined them thoroughly and then delivered a result that left them all stunned. There were no curses on any of them. They were completely clean, without so much as a trace of any active curse. Kush refused to accept this and pushed back hard, repeating what they had come for. The priest clarified patiently that while there was indeed evidence that curses had been present on them in the past, by every indication they had been entirely curse-free from the very day Gail had left their party. The priest added that it was something of a miracle they had survived curses of such considerable power in the first place. As they made their way out, the reality of what the priest had told them began to sink in. The conclusion was unavoidable. What they were experiencing now, this diminished state, was simply what they actually were without the enhancement Gail's curses had unknowingly been providing. Kush clenched his fist and refused to believe it, suggesting the priest had simply been incompetent. Luke admitted with difficulty that he did not want to accept it either, but he could no longer ignore the possibility that he had always been an average mage at best, perhaps even below average. Kush pushed that thought aside and refocused, insisting they needed to find Gail. He was certain Gail would be destitute by now, struggling somewhere on streets. Searching back alleys would be more productive than looking on main roads. Luke stopped him. He apologized and said he had had enough. It was time for him to cut his losses and walk away. He turned and left. Kush demanded to know what had gotten into him. Luke said bluntly that they had sold off most of their gear just to eat and pay for the pre-services. They could not afford a room at an inn. They looked wretched. If anyone belonged in a back alley right now, it was the four of them, not Gail. Kush grabbed Luke and told him he could not say that to his face. Luke struggled and then suddenly went very still. Kush asked what had happened, whether Luke was giving up already. But Luke was not giving up. He told Kush to look at the notice board. Kush crossed to it and snatched up the paper hanging there. Melissa and Norris moved in behind him, curious about what had caught his attention so aggressively. Luke watched with a quiet laugh, noting that it turned out Kush had not been entirely wrong after all. Kush read it and broke into laughter, declaring that their luck had finally turned. What he was holding was an official wanted poster issued by the royal office. It carried a depiction of the person sought, stated that the individual was wanted dead or alive by the royal government, and promised a reward for anyone who brought the person before the royal seat of government. Additional monetary consideration was offered for anyone providing useful information related to the case. Anyone who spotted the individual was directed to report immediately to the nearest royal government office. The document was issued under the authority of Gurmund de Gherkin IV, chief of the royal office. The person on the poster was Gail. Kush could barely contain himself. The entire group erupted in celebration. Kush pointed out that simply providing information about him would earn them money, but the possibilities beyond that were even more exciting. If they actually brought Gail back themselves, the reward could be something far greater. Their imaginations ran freely. Noble titles, land, jewels, whatever they might want. Their excitement surged back to life all at once. The royal office had not opened yet, but that did not matter to them. They were not just informants. They were his former party members. They knew him personally. That had to be worth far more than a tip, and they were not going to waste a moment getting there. At the start of Chapter 12, Princess Kara expressed out to Vivian about the informants she had found, wondering aloud whether they were simply swindlers looking to collect a reward. Vivian assured her that the group appeared to have genuinely useful information and had confirmed themselves to be an S-rank adventuring party from the Capital Guild. They had apparently worked alongside the young man the princess was looking for until quite recently. Before Vivian could elaborate any further, loud laughter erupted from the room where the party was waiting. One of them had even put their feet up on the table. One member commented on the expense of the carpet and questioned whether it was a good use of public funds. Another praised the tea cakes enthusiastically. A third agreed and called for more to be brought. Their leader, Kush, grumbled about how long royalty was making their informants wait and suggested they ought to charge a late fee for it. The princess had been quietly peeking in at the group and whispered to Vivian that they did not seem particularly pleasant, asking whether they were really S-rank. Vivian confirmed they were, more or less. Kush then caught sight of Vivian and the princess looking in and demanded to know what they were staring at. He called out to the princess and addressed her as the fancy lady. The princess addressed him by his first name. Kush stomped over to her, not knowing who she was, and corrected her sharply, saying she should be calling him Mr. Kush Bilbour and that his party were the finest adventurers in the entire town. He said she would need to be royalty herself to use his first name. The princess stopped Vivian from reacting and calmly apologized for not introducing herself sooner. She gave her name as Kara de Gherkin, princess of the country, and acknowledged that she had kept them waiting while she was observing, and asked Kush to accept her apology. A short while later, the princess was seated and Kush and his entire party had their heads bowed all the way to the floor in mortified apology for his earlier behavior. Kara told them not to worry about it and said they should get straight to business. She asked Kush to confirm whether he knew the person in the wanted poster. The party exchanged glances and grinned, confirming that they did. Vivian asked them to describe the young man they were looking for. Kush said he had black hair, dark eyes, and a medium build. Vivian pointed out that this description could match thousands of people. Melissa added that the man also dressed with absolutely no sense of style and wore a bluish-green jacket. The princess's eyes lit up, and she asked them to keep going. Norris said the accessories the man made were equally unimpressive and completely lacked any appealing aesthetic quality. The princess objected quietly, saying that was not true at all, which confused the party entirely. As far as the princess was concerned, those goods had been anything but unimpressive. Norris fumbled for a moment, and then gathered himself and told the princess the name of the person they were looking for. He was called Gail, their former companion and a curse crafter. He suggested they take a look at some of his items as evidence. Vivian examined the items and said there was no question about their authenticity. Kara asked what she meant. Vivian explained that during their investigation, they had discovered that this curse crafter had a habit of including free talismans with purchases from his stall. Kara noted with mild surprise that she had not received one herself. Vivian suggested this might be because Gail had been in the process of closing up when Kara came by, or perhaps because Kara had been in such a hurry that Gail had not had the chance. Vivian then turned to Luke and asked whether he was certain those items were genuinely the work of Gail and not something he had simply picked up elsewhere. Luke initially said he had taken them, then quickly corrected himself and said he had received them from Gail as gifts. He produced a dark skeleton eye-tooth ring, a carnivorous palette knife, and a witch powder necklace. Kush commented with surprise that Luke had been carrying all of that around this whole time. Norris wondered aloud whether the items might have been connected to their recent run of terrible luck. He then noticed that the princess seemed to be reacting badly to the items. What was actually happening was quite the opposite. The princess had covered her mouth with both hands and barely contained excitement, and then tried to compose herself before letting out a delighted exclamation that she was in absolute heaven. She gathered all of Gail's items and hugged them to herself with a radiant smile. Then she caught herself, remembered the party was in the room watching her, and quickly sat back down with dignity. She said calmly that they appear to be at least partially telling the truth. Kush insisted it was all the truth. Kara told Vivian to release their reward payment. The eyes of every party member immediately lit up with greed. Vivian asked whether Kara was simply being dazzled by the unsettling objects they had brought in. Kara said of course that was not the case. She handed Kush a bag of coins and explained it was an advance on the full reward to come. She said she needed to thank Gail personally and asked whether Kush understood her clearly on that point. Kush knelt down and declared she could count on him completely and swore on his life as the leader of the S-rank Wolfpack that he would deliver. Outside afterward, Kush laughed with satisfaction about the reward money and the retainer they had secured. Melissa congratulated him. Norris said they should begin searching for Gail right away. Luke said finding him would be straightforward enough. They agreed to split up and ask around the capital first. Kush said he knew Gail well after 3 years together and had a good sense of what he would be doing. Melissa would check the market stalls and the Merchants Guild since there was a real possibility Gail had set up a stall somewhere. Norris would cover the Adventurers Guild and the taverns, reasoning that knowing Gail he might be too stubborn to have gone very far. Luke would watch the carriages near the capital in case Gail had already left the city, though Kush doubted it. Kush also noted that the princess was clearly up to something herself, given how pointedly she had emphasized wanting to thank Gail personally. Melissa wondered what Gail could possibly have done to attract royal attention. Luke said that once they found him, they should be sure to thank him thoroughly for everything they had been through since he had left. Norris heartily agreed. The thanks they had in mind, however, involved beating him, handing him over to the palace, and letting whatever punishment followed take its course. They laughed together about it. The Wolfpack had thoroughly misunderstood what Princess Kara had meant by the word thank. Back at the castle, Vivian asked Kara whether she had been wise to trust that party so completely. She had not expected Kara to have made so much progress in tracking Gail down. Kara said the palace had not managed it on its own so far, so there was nothing to lose. Vivian looked at the updated caricature of Gail on the wanted poster. Kara said that with the party being S rank, she was curious to see what they were capable of, though she trusted Vivian to keep a careful eye on them, just in case. Vivian agreed. Kara turned the poster over and read the name written there. So his name was Gail. Gail, the curse crafter. She looked at the cursed ring on her finger and smiled, saying to herself how much she wanted to find out more about him. In the town of Farmage, Gail sneezed without warning. He remarked casually to himself that perhaps some fan of his gear was talking about him. He paused for a moment, and then broke into a delighted and slightly giddy laugh, turning his attention back to the lich rib bones he was working on, chanting quietly to himself about the process of polishing them to enhance their magic resistance and dark element force, while noting that doing so would reduce their light element and melee defense properties. Gale continued working through his process, planning to mix in powdered dark skeleton bone to boost the melee offense of the item and cancel out the unwanted effect. Combined with the light element boost drawn from Thunderwisp's core, the piece would be complete. The sorcerer's dropped sword, with his talismans incorporated into it, had become something he considered a genuine masterpiece. He decided it would serve as a commemoration of his first time in Farmage. He named it the Divide. The sword carried a boost to blood effect on the original blade, added a bloodsucker property to sustain the user's stamina, increased slashing force by 150%, boosted magic resistance, reduced the weapon's overall weight, and improved its dustproofing properties. Without warning, Moria appeared in his room and struck him, telling him to stop talking to himself. He asked why she was in his room. Moria said her room was right next door, and she had been listening to him carry on all day and night. She also noted that his room was dark and had an unpleasant smell, then went ahead and opened the window to air it out. Gale asked if she had come just to complain. Moria said she wanted him to stop his noise and his smell, but reminded him that today was the day he was planning to open a stall in Farmage. She announced she was going with him, and noted with some satisfaction that the weather was lovely. Gale agreed, and they headed out. At the market, Gale set himself up as a vendor and called out loudly to attract customers, announcing that he had cursed goods made from fresh, undead materials. He was surrounded on either side by other vendors, one selling freshly baked bread and another selling rice balls for breakfast, both calling out to customers in the same enthusiastic way. Moria stood nearby watching him with visible displeasure. The market was busy and full of stalls in every direction. Customers gathered at the rice stall, drawn in by news of new ingredients being used, and happily picked one up to try. Meanwhile, Gale kept calling out and even tried to suggest customers pair his curse gear with their food. He was turned down. A group of customers passed another stall, praising the butcher there for particularly tender and well-fattened turkey legs, and Gale called out to them suggesting they try his skeleton chopsticks, claiming the item would tenderize even tough meat very quickly. He was turned down again. He then approached a merchant and offered to let them try the cursed sword he had built from the sorcerer's blade. The merchant recoiled in disgust and walked away quickly. Moria came up behind Gale and asked grimly what exactly he thought he was doing. Gale asked if she had her eye on the sword, offering her a special price on it. Moria said absolutely not, and reached out to take it away from him. He clutched the sword tightly to himself and demanded to know what had gotten into her, insisting this was a valuable item, and that regardless of what Moria thought, he was drawing the line at anyone taking it from him. Moria told him at the rate he was going, the entire town was going to be drawing the line with him shortly. She asked what he thought he was doing selling that kind of thing at the crack of dawn, and right beside the food vendors at that. Gale argued that the Merchants Guild had told him sales were busiest in the morning and evening. Moria said that might be true for food stalls, but that selling curse gear to people looking for a quick breakfast made no sense at all. She asked whether he had any understanding of supply and demand. Gale said he did, describing it simply as people wanting things and merchants selling them. Moria told him to think about that a little more carefully. She pointed out this was a farming town and that he needed to adjust his approach to suit the community. She asked him what the kind of goods were that would actually sell in a place like this. Gale murmured through a list of options including poison talismans, paralysis scrolls, slowness darts, and cursed daggers and bucklers, then slapped his hands together and declared that cursed headbands might be the answer. Moria grabbed him by the arm and announced that was enough, and he was coming with her. Gale protested that his stall was still open and that someone might steal his goods. Moria told him the items were too off-putting for anyone to bother stealing. Later, at the guild, Gimli was laughing and said it must be a genuine challenge for Moria to have a partner like Gale. Both Gale and Moria immediately said they were not partners. Gimli teased them that their timing was perfectly synchronized. Gale then told Gimli about the spot he had secured through the Merchants Guild, explaining that he had paid for it and everything. Gimli asked how much. When Gale told her it had been 1 gold coin, both Gimli and Moria reacted with shock. Moria asked whether that was really the going rate for a stall in Farmage. Gimli said of course not, and that Gale had been taken advantage of. Gale refused to believe it, insisting the Merchants Guild had assured him it was in the busiest part of the market. Gimli closed her eyes and explained patiently that finding a spot in a busy area was only part of what mattered when setting up stall. She was not sure how things had worked back in the capital, but in Farmage the people passing through the market were mostly traveling between their homes and their fields. They were in the market for farming equipment, not cursed items. Gail felt deflated and said that was terrible news. Gimli said there was still some demand for cursed goods, pointing specifically to the adventurers who worked through their guild. Gail's expression brightened immediately. However, Gimli said that alone would not be enough to fix the problem. He would need to relocate his stall first. She asked whether he had looked into the nicer districts of town. Gail said the Merchants Guild had told him that area was already at full capacity. Gimli asked whether it had actually appeared full when he passed by it. Gail said that he and Moria had walked past it on the way to the market, and there had clearly been open space available. Moria flatly confirmed there had been. Gimli smiled and said she was beginning to understand the situation. She explained that while Farmage was not the largest town, it was significant enough that guilds based in the capital and larger cities had set up branches there. She then said they were going to head out for a little while. Moria asked where they were going. Gimli said they were going to the Smith's Guild. Moria was caught off guard and asked why on earth they needed to go there.